The man known to history as Ulysses S. Grant was born as Hiram Ulysses Grant on the 27th of April 1822 in Point Pleasant, a small rural community in the southwest of the relatively young state of Ohio. His father was Jesse Root Grant, a farmer, tanner, and leather merchant who hailed originally from Pennsylvania and who could trace his ancestry in America back to the first establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Jesse had moved westwards along with so many Americans in the early 19th century in search of new opportunities as the United States expanded from the east coast of North America. Ulysses' mother was Hannah Grant, originally Hannah Simpson. Her ancestry lay amongst the Presbyterian Scots, who had moved from Scotland to Ulster in the north of Ireland during the 17th century, and then emigrated again in great numbers from Ireland to North America in the course of the 18th century. She had married Jesse Grant in 1821, and Ulysses was their first child. She was a deeply religious woman, and Ulysses is believed to have taken after his mother more than his father, although he might well have acquired his anti-slavery stance from Jesse, who was a proclaimed abolitionist, meaning that he wished for slavery to be brought to an end throughout the United States. Ulysses would grow up in a large household, as he had 5 siblings: Simpson, Clara, Orville, Jenny, and Mary. The family was well enough off that Ulysses was provided with a substantial education at numerous private schools. This included a stint at the Rankin Academy in 1838. This was run by John Rankin, a noted abolitionist and educator who was prominent in running the Underground Railroad at the time. This was a system of safe houses and transport networks which abolitionists in America used to help escape slaves in the southern states of America to flee from slavery. Grant was growing up at a time when the United States was expanding swiftly, having largely been confined to a series of states along the eastern seaboard of North America in the 18th century. American eyes were turning west from 1800 onwards, with expansion towards the Great Lakes in the north and westwards towards the Mississippi River and the border with Spain's colonial possessions in Texas, New Mexico, and California. Beyond this territorial expansion, the social fabric of the country was shifting dramatically. Under British rule, slavery had been practiced throughout the colonies, though it was engaged in to a much greater extent in the southern colonies of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, with their sprawling cotton and tobacco plantations. Change was on the way though, as by 1800 a number of northern states, including New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, inspired by the abolitionist movement, had banned slavery. By the time of Grant's birth, others, such as New Jersey, had become free states, while the period of his youth and adolescence saw the states directly to the west, such as Illinois and Michigan, follow their more liberal neighbors to the east. But the southern states remained unswerving in their defense of the institution of slavery, and so the stage was already being set during Grant's youth for a titanic struggle between the northern and southern states. Ultimately, Ulysses would find himself foisted into the conflicts of American society in the mid-19th century, owing to a decision made by his father in 1839. At this time, when Ulysses was still just 17, his father requested an acquaintance to nominate his son to the United States Military Academy at West Point in the state of New York, then, as now, the leading military academy in the United States. The application was successful, though, owing to an error in his registration, Hiram Ulysses Grant was recorded as Cadet Ulysses S. Grant on entry. This new name stuck. Grant was initially skeptical about life at West Point, but he eventually grew into it, acquiring a reputation while there for his equestrian skills. Though, more broadly, he was only an average pupil. When he graduated in June 1843, he did so ranked 21st of 39 cadets in his class. Having finished at West Point, he was quickly appointed to the 4th Infantry Division and sent to St. Louis in the state of Missouri as a brevet second lieutenant. Grant seems to have been relatively uncommitted to a military career at this point and considered this a temporary posting, from which he might retire in a year or two. Yet it was a highly significant period in other ways. While at West Point, Grant had befriended Frederick Tracy Dent, a fellow cadet who was slightly older than Ulysses. Dent originally hailed from Whitehaven near St. Louis, and Grant became a regular visitor at the Dent household following his arrival in Missouri. He had soon struck up a relationship with Dent's sister, Julia, and in 1844 they were engaged. The union, though, would not be formalized into a marriage for another 4 years, as war on the southern border interrupted their plans in this regard. The war, which erupted in 1846, was the direct result of the contentious position of Texas between the United States and Mexico, traditionally part of Spain's colonial possessions in Central America. Texas had become part of Mexico when the country acquired independence from its mother country, Spain, in the early 1820s. However, Texas's position within the broader Mexican state was always contentious, and in 1836 it broke away into a new Republic of Texas. Thereafter, it gravitated towards the US, and when he was elected as president late in 1844, a major plank of James Polk's policy platform was expansion of the United States into Texas. This was duly accomplished in 1845 with the formal annexation of the Republic of Texas. However, Mexico was unwilling to accept this new dispensation. In particular, a boundary dispute arose over where the new border between the US and Mexico should lie, Polk's administration favoring the Rio Grande, and the Mexican government arguing that the frontier should be located along the more northerly Nueces River. These issues spilled over into war in 1846. Grant's role in the war was limited as a junior officer, but also formative in its own way, as he fought at the Battle of Palo Alto, the first major clash of the war, near Brownsville in Texas on the 8th of May 1846. It was also the first time Grant had seen active combat. He subsequently served as a regimental quartermaster further west towards California and then in Mexico itself in 1847. He earned a commendation for his role in the Battle of Molino del Rey, fought near Mexico City in September 1847. And so, while he did not have any major command during the US-Mexican War, it is increasingly viewed as an important period in his career as a military commander. It was between 1846 and 1848 that Grant gained his first experience of warfare, and it was to be the only war he fought in prior to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, and as such, it must be considered his most active training period for the later conflict. Ultimately, the US-Mexican War ended in a total US victory. Having secured the border regions in the opening months of the conflict, General Winfield Scott advanced into Mexico itself in the spring of 1847, eventually occupying Mexico City, a campaign which Grant was involved in. The resulting Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, agreed in February 1848, saw Mexico acknowledge US control over Texas, while the Rio Grande was established as the border between the two nations. Consequently, while the US did not take the opportunity provided by its complete military victory to acquire further land from Mexico, the peace essentially consolidated its position in Texas and established the modern border between the two countries. In the aftermath of the US-Mexican War, Grant returned to St. Louis and married Julia Dent. Theirs was a close relationship, though initially it caused a rupture between Grant and his parents, who were discontented with the Dents being slave owners. Despite their family squabbling, which continued with varying degrees of intensity for decades to come, there is little doubting Ulysses and Julia's affection for one another. She had a cast in her left eye and squinted as a result of it, a characteristic which years later, when Ulysses became president, she considered having surgery to correct. He vetoed the idea, stating that he loved her just as she was. Evidently, it was Julia's liveliness and other character traits which made Ulysses devoted to her. Eventually, they would have 4 children, 3 boys, Frederick, Ulysses Jr., and Jesse, and a girl named Ellen. But Ulysses and Julia's early family life was repeatedly interrupted by Grant's military postings. In the years following the US-Mexican War, he was moved around several times to different military commands in Detroit and New York State, but it was finally to California that he was dispatched in the early 1850s. Gold had been discovered out on the west coast, and as settlement increased there around the middle of the century, a heightened military presence was needed. Julia was heavily pregnant at the time, and Grant was forced to leave her in the east, while he headed west. The next few years were a bleak period. Grant was moved around repeatedly across California and the Oregon Territory. In an effort to better support his young family back home, he entered into several business ventures on the side, each of which failed. Then he started drinking more heavily, the beginnings of a long acquaintance he would have with the bottle. And eventually it was repeated acts of drunkenness and the clashes these caused with his commanding officers which led him to resign from the military on the 31st of September 1854. Thus, at 32 years of age, and with no idea of what he might do henceforth, Grant headed back east to St. Louis to be reunited with his wife and family. Life outside the military, though, did not bring any relief from his hardships, as back in St. Louis, things went from bad to worse. Having accepted a farm allotment from Julia's father, he nevertheless continued to struggle financially, in part owing to an economic recession in the US in 1857. A venture into real estate proved abortive, and in the late 1850s, Grant was reduced to selling firewood on a St. Louis street corner to make some extra cash, and even pawned a gold watch, a prized possession at one point. Years later, F. Scott Fitzgerald would state that there are no second acts in American life. He should perhaps have considered the highly successful second act of Ulysses S. Grant before making this assertion. In the early 1860s, Grant's life was to take a striking turn, brought about almost entirely by the crisis which enveloped America in the aftermath of the election of Abraham Lincoln as the 16th President of the United States in the presidential election of November 1860. Tensions had been brewing for decades between the free states in the north of the United States and the slave-owning states of the South. Now in 1860, Lincoln, though willing to compromise with the slave-owning states, was built into a bogeyman by the southern states, one who would seek to end slavery altogether in America. As a result, upon his election, the state of South Carolina seceded from the Union in December 1860. It was soon joined by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas in that decision, and these 7 breakaway southern states formed themselves into a confederacy. Outright armed hostilities between the Northern Union and the Southern Confederacy commenced in April 1861, when Confederate forces attacked a Union-held garrison at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, following which several more southern states seceded and joined the Confederacy, the capital of which was eventually established at Richmond in Virginia. The American Civil War had begun. Upon the outbreak of hostilities in the spring of 1861, Grant rejoined the army after a near 7-year absence. In the initial stages of the conflict, he was involved in efforts to recruit and train forces in Missouri and Illinois, but it was not long before he had been given a command in southern Illinois, based on his previous military experience. He would spend the first year of the war operating in the border region between southern Illinois and Kentucky, and further south towards Tennessee, playing a delicate balancing act in areas where military heavy-handedness was frowned upon in the hopes that these communities straddling the North and the South could be won over to the Union cause. At the beginning of 1862, frustrated by his lack of major commands, Grant sought and received permission from General Henry Halleck to undertake an offensive campaign. Campaigning south with 25,000 men, he won one of the first major victories of the war for the Union, when he besieged and captured Fort Donelson on the River Cumberland in Tennessee. About 15,000 Confederate troops in total were captured in the engagement. Moreover, Grant had proved his daring and activist approach. When the commander of Fort Donelson had inquired as to what terms of surrender might be offered, Grant had replied that the only terms he was prepared to offer were unconditional surrender, as he intended to move presently against the fort. As a result of his actions at Fort Donelson, Grant was now promoted to the rank of Major General. 2 months later, he was the major Union commander at the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee on the 6th of April 1862, where over 100,000 Union and Confederate troops fought. Grant was theoretically victorious and repelled the Confederate incursion into the region, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, which resulted in over 10,000 Union troops being either killed or wounded. Grant's reputation, which had soared following the seizure of Fort Donelson, was now damaged. This was probably not aided by reports of his drinking. While we can probably dismiss legendary tales about Grant keeping a barrel of whiskey outside his tent while on campaign during the Civil War, there seems to be much truth to allegations that he was a heavy binge drinker on occasion, although one who often abstained for considerable periods of time. The most likely scenario suggests that Grant was prone to bouts of heavy drinking, but rarely drank heavily when he knew some important task lay ahead of him. Despite these setbacks, before the end of 1862, Grant had convinced his superiors to allow him to proceed towards Mississippi, where he planned to seize Vicksburg, one of the Confederates' major strongholds on the Mississippi River. This he duly succeeded in accomplishing 6 months later, when it finally surrendered on the 4th of July 1863. Grant's actions here were particularly notable, as the Vicksburg campaign ensured Union control of the Mississippi River, effectively cutting the Confederacy in two, between those states further to the west and the core of the southern states to the east of the Mississippi. While Grant was making a major name for himself in Tennessee and Mississippi, the war was proceeding with mixed results for both sides. While 1861 had seen the outbreak of the war and the consolidation of the Confederacy, in 1862 it settled into a particularly intense campaign in the eastern states around Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, where the Union and Confederacy were in the peculiar position of having their respective capitals less than 100 miles away from each other. But it was in 1863 that the war really turned. It was this year that Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, making the abolition of slavery in the Confederate States a stated war goal for the Union. Henceforth, it was clear that victory for the Union in the war would mean an end to the institution of slavery throughout the United States. Having won a significant victory repelling the Union forces at Chancellorsville in Virginia, the leading Confederate general Robert E. Lee undertook a campaign into the north through Pennsylvania in the early summer of 1863. This culminated in the 3-day-long Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania between the 1st and 3rd of July, the bloodiest engagement of the entire Civil War. Gettysburg saw Lee's Army of Northern Virginia heavily defeated, with nearly 25,000 of his 75,000-man army either killed or wounded. It was a turning point in the entire conflict, which combined with Grant's seizure of Vicksburg to the west a day later on the 4th of July, put the Union on the offensive. It has also gone down in history as much for Lincoln's address to mark the battle the following November, in which he spoke of the great Civil War being fought to ensure that freedom shall not perish from the earth. Meanwhile, in recognition of his prowess in the field and accomplishments in the seizure of Vicksburg and other strategic sites, Grant was appointed as Lieutenant General in March 1864 and placed in overall command of the Union Army. He was now in charge of the effort to finally defeat the Confederacy and bring the war to an end. Grant's strategy was relatively simple in 1864. He intended to use the Union's numerical superiority to essentially confine Robert E. Lee's forces, protecting Richmond within the state of Virginia, while several of his sub-commanders would conduct campaigns further to the south and southwest, for instance, seizing Georgia. This strategy was broadly successful elsewhere, although despite the tightening of the noose on Richmond, Grant failed to take the Confederate capital in 1864, even after a near 2-week-long bloody engagement at Cold Harbor some 10 miles from the city ended in a stalemate. Grant's forces now settled in June 1864 into what would become a 9-month siege of the town of Petersburg, not far from Richmond. As it wore on, though, the siege of Petersburg became symptomatic of the Confederate cause in general. The breakaway affiliation was now largely confined to isolated centers of control out further west in Alabama and Texas, and a strip of land running along the east coast around Virginia and parts of the Carolinas and Georgia. By the autumn of 1864, the city of Atlanta in Georgia had been captured, and the Union Army had advanced as far as the Atlantic coast in parts of the South. As the winter set in, Lee's troops in Virginia began to desert in large numbers, owing to starvation and the general hopelessness of the Confederate cause. And by the spring of 1865, Lee's position was hopeless. The American Civil War eventually came to an end on the 9th of April 1865. A week earlier, Lee had abandoned the line which he had been trying to hold around Petersburg. Richmond was now open to a Union advance. As a result, on the 9th of April, Lee agreed to meet with Grant in the courthouse in the village of Appomattox in Virginia to negotiate the surrender of the Confederacy. Here, the two generals reminisced about their experiences in the war with Mexico nearly 20 years earlier, before getting round to the business of ending the Civil War. Grant, for his part, was authorized to negotiate that there would be few reprisals of any kind for those who laid down their weapons. As a result, when word spread west to the Confederate forces in those states, the surrender was quickly agreed to, and the last fighting occurred in Texas at the end of May. Yet the man who had been at the center of these events would never live to see the ultimate cessation of hostilities. On the 14th of April, just 5 days after Lee had surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a stage actor and Confederate sympathizer, in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Grant himself had nearly been present with Lincoln, having turned down an offer to attend the performance with the president. Indeed, allegations flew in the days that followed that Grant was also a target of Booth and his co-conspirators. They were unsuccessful if he was. Grant lived, and Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, was sworn in as the great man's successor. The end of the war witnessed the inception of the policy of Reconstruction. On the surface, this was aimed primarily at bringing slavery to an end in the Confederate States and ending the remnants of secession in the South. But such was the manner in which slavery was ingrained into every aspect of the economy and society of the Southern states that Reconstruction would also necessarily require a massive program of social and economic reform if the Southern states were to evolve to become more like their more liberal Union neighbors to the North. Reconstruction would dominate U.S. politics during the immediate aftermath of the war, and primarily throughout Grant's presidency from 1869 to 1877. Even prior to his tenure in the White House, Grant was involved in Reconstruction politics. In the months after the conclusion of the Civil War, he was sent on a tour of the Southern states at the behest of President Johnson. This was important for two reasons. Grant was received favorably during his travels throughout the former Confederate states, somewhat surprisingly given his position as the Union's foremost general. This indicated that he could be a unifying figure during the Reconstruction period. Secondly, Grant submitted a report to Johnson upon completion of his tour, in which he recommended a lenient approach towards the former Confederate states he had just visited, in order to help end the bitterness of the Civil War. His drift towards politics did not end there. In 1866, he was appointed a general of the Federal Army, now that the Union titles of recent years were dispensed with. And then, in 1867, when Johnson removed Edwin M. Stanton from his position as Secretary of War, Grant was offered the position. Grant accepted the office on an interim basis in August 1867. However, a constitutional problem now arose surrounding the Tenure of Office Act. This dictated that a sitting cabinet secretary could only be removed by the executive with the consent of the Senate. As such, Johnson needed Stanton's removal to be sanctioned by the upper house of Congress. When the Senate refused to approve Stanton's dismissal in December 1867, Grant resigned in January, provoking a split with Johnson in the process, who had believed that Grant would refuse to relinquish his position as Secretary of War. This resulted in the decision over Stanton being sent to the courts for adjudication, Johnson's desired outcome. The major outcome of the split from Johnson and Grant's brief flirtation with the office of Secretary of War was that he was now viewed as a potential presidential candidate within the Republican Party. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago in mid-May 1868, Grant won the party's support. He would run against the Democrat Horatio Seymour, a former governor of the state of New York. The Civil War hero ran in the months that followed on a campaign slogan of "Let us have peace." Ultimately, the election race was much closer than many observers had expected. Overall, Grant won by just 300,000 votes in the popular vote, although the Electoral College result was much more comprehensive, Grant securing 214 votes compared to just 80 for Seymour. As a result, on the 4th of March 1869, Ulysses S. Grant was sworn into office as the 18th President of the United States. He would serve for 8 years, winning a second term in 1872, with a much more comprehensive victory over a divided opposition. During the 8 years in which he served as President of the United States, Grant would have to grapple with a large number of very grave challenges. None was more pressing than the issue of Reconstruction and the reunifying of the country after the trauma of a 4-year civil war. 2 weeks after entering office, he signed laws guaranteeing African Americans equal rights. Then, in the months that followed, his administration pressured those former Confederate states which had not ratified the 15th Amendment into doing so. This would guarantee Black Americans the right to vote in elections. The trade-off for the Southern states in accepting this would be readmittance to the Union once it had been ratified by each state legislature. As a result of this carrot-and-stick approach, by 1871, the recalcitrant states, including Georgia, Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas, had complied and were readmitted to the Union. But in other respects, Reconstruction under Grant proved more difficult. Armed bands of traditional Southern conservatives sprung up across the former Confederate states in the late 1860s and early 1870s. The Ku Klux Klan was just the most prominent of these, and others, such as the Red Shirts and White League, collectively termed Redeemers, strove to use violence and intimidation to reclaim control of the southern states of the Democratic Party and force through a white supremacist agenda. In response, Grant's administration created the U.S. Justice Department and charged it with cracking down on white Redeemer movements in the South. In tandem, the Federal Army was dispatched to key sites in order to maintain law and order and defend Reconstruction. The result, it is generally acknowledged, is that Grant's administration crushed the power of the Ku Klux Klan for a generation in the South by arresting hundreds of senior members and prosecuting many of its most powerful benefactors who financed the Klan. Nevertheless, despite these efforts, it was clear by the mid-1870s that Reconstruction was largely failing, and Redeemer Democrats were seeking to create a society in the South, which, in the absence of slavery, would still disenfranchise and savagely oppress the large African American population across the former Confederate states. Reconstruction was intimately tied to the finances of the country. During the war, the Union government had resorted to issuing banknotes that were not backed up by the gold or silver standard. In the 19th century, all Western governments only issued money that was backed by a certain amount of gold and silver bullion reserves. The emergency caused by the Civil War had seen Lincoln's administration resorting to simply printing banknotes, resulting in considerable inflation. To correct the situation, Grant passed the Public Credit Act within 3 weeks of entering office. This essentially promised those who held banknotes issued during the Civil War that they would be repaid in coin backed by the gold and silver standard. The idea here was to curb inflation and also introduce much greater confidence into the financial system that the Civil War banknotes, termed greenback notes, were as good as real money and would not become worthless now that the war was receding in the collective memory. The overall effect of this was a continuation of the economic recovery, which had already started under Johnson's administration between 1865 and 1869. Yet it was not all smooth sailing on the financial front across the 8 years of Grant's administration. In 1873, an economic crisis developed following the collapse of the New York brokerage firm J. Cook and Company, which was heavily involved in the railway building boom of the time. As the west and east coasts were connected via extensive train lines, this was compounded by frailties in the global economic system, with Germany having demonetized silver in the aftermath of the unification of the country in 1871, triggering a series of financial failures in European capitals such as Vienna. The resulting downturn led to an economic depression which would linger for the remainder of Grant's second term, creating financial hardship for many American citizens. The economic crisis was known at the time as the Great Depression, but this term was abandoned 70 years later when a much deeper economic crisis led to the period after the Wall Street crash of 1929 becoming known as the Great Depression. Accordingly, the economic crash and depression of 1873 to 1877 is today termed the Panic of 1873. On the foreign stage, Grant's policies were calm and pacifist. Despite his military background, he was no warmonger and deliberately tried to avoid conflict. However, he was also thoroughly inexperienced as a diplomat and left his foreign policy largely in the hands of the Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish. A number of issues confronted the US in the late 1860s. Firstly, the matter of reparations, and an apology from the British government for its supplying of naval support to the Confederacy during the Civil War remained unresolved. Several years of negotiations eventually resulted in the Treaty of Washington in 1871, whereby Britain acknowledged its role in building ships for the Confederacy and agreed to pay over $15 million in reparations. Thereafter, US-British relations improved steadily, and the two countries have been allies ever since. Just as pressing was the US's policy in the Caribbean, where a war, the 10 Years' War, had broken out between Cuban rebels and Spain in 1868. Despite occurring on its front door, the US maintained a policy of fairly strict neutrality in this, the first of 3 independence wars waged on the island of Cuba in the second half of the 19th century. More interventionist was the approach of the Grant administration to the island of Hispaniola. Then, as now, this was divided into 2 countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, or Santo Domingo. Grant was of the view that by acquiring control over Santo Domingo, the US could gain a strategic interest in the Caribbean and also in the lucrative sugar trade of the region. In 1869, negotiations were opened with the government there to purchase the country, with US business interests acting as intermediaries. But after 18 months of wrangling over this, the scheme came to nothing, largely owing to the opposition from within Congress. The affair tarnished Grant's reputation to some extent, and is an indication of the creeping imperialist aspirations of the US in advance of the most aggressive period of American empire in the 1890s. Grant's approach towards the Native American people was enlightened by 19th century standards. He was a relatively benign assimilationist, believing that the Native American people should be treated fairly and enjoined to embrace the benefits of a Western education, economy, culture, and government. This might seem like a heavy-handed form of cultural intolerance by today's standards, but for a country which counted several presidencies in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, whose policies towards the Native American people had bordered on genocidal, Grant's approach was comparatively progressive. As a result, several peace treaties were negotiated with the Apache and Sioux ends of the Plains and Midwest during his first term in office, and conflict between the Native American people and the federal government was at an historic low. However, Grant's Native American policy could ultimately not escape the historical circumstances in which it was conceived. Try as he might to forge a new pathway, decades of conflict, oppression, and broken promises had created a thick air of animosity towards the US government amongst the Plains Indians. This was compounded in 1874 when gold was discovered in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory. As prospectors streamed into the region, the Sioux Indians there, led by Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull, prepared for conflict. The Great Sioux War of 1876 and 1877 was a bitter end to Grant's presidency. Though famed for the victory, Sitting Bull's Lakota Sioux Indians won over General George A. Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn in late June 1876. The war ultimately ended in victory for the federal government. The administration of Rutherford B. Hayes, who had succeeded Grant by the time the war ended, imposed a harsh peace settlement whereby the lands of the Sioux were annexed and the Plains Indians of the region were forced into Indian reservations, a depressing end to Grant's enlightened Indian policy. In many other ways, Grant was ahead of his time. For instance, in 1875, he proposed a constitutional amendment to fundamentally weaken the ability of religious groups and churches to dominate the educational curriculum in a given state or region. Essentially, here he was calling for greater separation of church and state in a manner which was only beginning to be countenanced in the more liberal European countries. Equally, he was progressive in his advocacy for America's Jews, appointing dozens of Jewish Americans to federal office. Perhaps most unusual was his appointment of Eli S. Parker, a Seneca Indian, as his Commissioner for Indian Affairs. Yet Grant's presidency was not without scandal either. During the 1872 election campaign, the press revealed that a number of prominent members of the Republican Party had been involved in siphoning profits from the Union Pacific Railroad Company through a shady corporate entity called Crédit Mobilier. Grant, who it must be said was scrupulously honest throughout his military and political career, was not implicated directly, but the fallout, nevertheless, damaged the Republicans, and by implication, his presidency. Worse followed in 1875 with the so-called Whiskey Ring Scandal. This had involved prominent federal officials and whiskey distillers defrauding the government out of tax revenues, facilitated by a widespread system of bribery. Again, Grant was not involved, but his private secretary, Orville E. Babcock, was, as was the Secretary of War, William Belknap. Resignations followed, but Grant again was damaged in the final 2 years of his presidency by the actions of others. The final act of Grant's presidency became one of the most controversial moments in the constitutional and electoral history of the United States, though Grant acquitted himself well throughout the course of it. With Grant having served 2 terms, the Republican Party had selected Rutherford B. Hayes to contest the 1876 presidential election against the Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden. The election was held on the 7th of November 1876. The result, when it came, was highly contentious. In the mid-1870s, there were 369 electoral college votes. When the votes were counted, it was clear that Tilden had won 184 votes, one short of the 185 needed to be elected president. Hayes had certainly won 165 votes, but 20 votes were the subject of considerable dispute. These were the electoral college votes for the states of Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon. In the case of Oregon, the vote was contested as one of the electors for the state was found to be illegitimate, as he was an appointed official there, while in the other 3 states the vote was close enough that both parties claimed victory. The dispute dragged on into 1877. As it did, Grant, as the sitting president, came center stage. He instructed Congress to resolve the matter through legislative action and according to the electoral rules. He also refrained from mobilizing the army in the event of continuing disagreement, and on the 29th of January 1877, he formed an electoral commission to decide on the matter. This eventually resulted in what was to become known as the Compromise of 1877. Under its terms, Rutherford B. Hayes was elected as the 19th President of the United States, a decision which was certainly fair, as the surviving evidence indicates that Hayes had actually won the 4 states in contention, though by less than 1,000 votes in the cases of both Florida and South Carolina. As such, Hayes would enter the White House with the smallest winning margin in the U.S. electoral history, winning the Electoral College vote by 185 votes to Tilden's 184 votes. But his victory came at a cost. In return for their acceptance of the result, the Democrats demanded that federal troops, which had been stationed across the former Confederacy states in the South since the end of the Civil War, should be removed from states such as Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. In the aftermath of their departure, the Democrats tightened their grip on the southern states, essentially rejecting Reconstruction and opting for a harsh imposition of Jim Crow laws, which disenfranchised the free African American community in the South of the United States. Part of Grant's legacy has been tied up in his role in the Compromise of 1877 and the manner in which it allowed for the oppression of the African American communities of the southern states for decades to come. Yet Grant can hardly be held accountable for this. The southern states always seemed likely to set out on the path which they did in 1877, and Grant can hardly have prevented this in his final days in office. Conversely, at the time, he was widely praised for the manner in which he averted a constitutional crisis and renewed violence across the United States through his handling of the election crisis. Once the compromise was reached and Hayes eventually took up office in early March 1877, Grant was once again a private citizen. He was still just 54 years of age, a markedly young age for a man who had served an 8-year term and who had already lived such an eventful life up to that point. Given this, his later years might seem like something of an anticlimax, but they were not without their own considerable points of interest. First up was a world tour which he and Julia undertook. Over a 2.5-year period between the early summer of 1877 and the autumn of 1879, Europe was first on the itinerary, with the Grants travelling to England to meet with Queen Victoria before a long sojourn through continental Europe, in which audiences were had with Pope Leo XIII and the Chancellor of the newly established German Empire, Otto von Bismarck. Others whom they met with included Napoleon III of France and the celebrated German composer Richard Wagner. Further travel was then undertaken to the Holy Land and Egypt before returning to Europe and then heading onwards to Asia in 1879. The last leg of the world tour was the most interesting in many respects. While visiting Meiji, Japan, Grant became involved in efforts to establish a lasting peace between Japan and Qing China, during the course of which he got caught up in a conspiracy which aimed to assassinate both the Emperor Meiji and Grant himself. The Grants finally returned to the US, arriving in San Francisco in September 1879. During their long circumnavigation of the globe, Grant had received petitions from members of the Republican Party asking him to run again for the presidential office. In the 19th century, and for much of the 20th century, until the passage of the 22nd Amendment to the US Constitution by Congress in 1947, there was no legal barrier to serving more than 2 terms in office. However, tradition dictated that no one typically should serve more than 2 terms, in line with a precedent which George Washington had established. Now, however, many believed that tradition should be ignored to bring Grant back for a 3rd term. Grant was not indisposed to the scheme, and so encouraged his supporters to put forward his name at the Republican National Convention, which met at Chicago in early June 1880. What followed was a chaotic convention. 3 main candidates, Grant, James Blaine, and John Sherman, were the candidates. Grant secured the most votes in the initial voting, but not enough to reach the 370 votes required for any candidate to be officially selected by the party. After dozens of subsequent votes, the impasse was finally broken when Blaine's supporters conceived of a scheme to nominate a compromise candidate in the shape of James Garfield, like Grant, a former Union general who had fought in the Civil War. Realizing he was beaten, Grant eventually threw his backing behind Garfield. The Republicans finally had a candidate, one who won the subsequent presidential election, but he did not last long in office, as Garfield was assassinated in September 1881, just months after his inauguration, becoming the second of 4 US presidents to have been killed in office. His vice president, Chester A. Arthur, succeeded Garfield and served until 1885. In the aftermath of his world tour and his failed presidential bid, Grant returned to the world of business. This was a time when US presidents did not receive a pension after leaving office, and Grant had never been an affluent man, nor had he ever been an astute businessman, and his post-presidential ventures proved no exception to this rule. Incredibly, the Grants had actually lost money on their world tour, where Grant could have capitalized on his renown to profit from it, and a venture into the railway sector in the early 1880s also proved unfruitful. Then, in 1883, Grant became involved in a Wall Street business venture which his son Buck had undertaken with Ferdinand Ward, a financier and a conman. In New York City, Ward was soon engaging in highly fraudulent activity involving hundreds of thousands of dollars in what was effectively a pyramid scheme. As a silent partner, Grant was almost certainly oblivious to what was happening, but Buck Grant was quite possibly privy to Ward's actions. In any event, Grant himself testified against Ward in court in 1885, shortly before his own death, and when the full details emerged, it actually elicited public sympathy for Grant, who had been swindled considerably by Ward. While all of this was unfolding in New York, the former president was working away at what became the only truly profitable business venture of his entire life. A renowned storyteller, Grant decided in the early 1880s to write his memoirs. His financial situation was inestimably aided by an offer by Mark Twain to publish the memoirs and guarantee Grant 70% of the royalties, an enormous percentage which was a clear act of charity on Twain's part. Eventually finished in the early summer of 1885, the memoirs have been well regarded ever since, with Grant depicting himself fairly and accurately by most standards. They became a bestseller, and Julia Grant was able to live a comfortable later life from the proceeds of royalties, which nearly reached $500,000 in sales, a huge sum for the late 19th century. Yet Grant would never live to see his memoirs published. In the summer of 1884, he had developed a throat problem, which was subsequently diagnosed in October as throat cancer. It advanced rapidly, and Grant would ultimately die from it on the 23rd of July, 1885, just days after finishing his memoirs, and at the relatively young age of 63. Over 1.5 million people attended Grant's funeral in a long 11-kilometer procession through New York City on the 8th of August 1885. In sharp contrast to later impressions of his presidency, Grant was eulogized at the time as being comparable to George Washington. He was buried in Riverside Park, but his body was later re-entombed at the purpose-built General Grant National Memorial in the Morningside Heights neighborhood of Upper Manhattan, where it remains the largest burial tomb dedicated to an individual in the entirety of North America. During the 20th century, Ulysses S. Grant suffered from a poor reputation as one of the worst presidents of the United States, a belief repeatedly reaffirmed in polls and surveys. Views on him have changed to some extent in the last 20 years, but even so, this slightly more positive view of the 18th president has only seen him jump up the rankings to be considered about the 25th best or so of the 46 US presidents. Yet what the foregoing has sought to highlight is that this historical impression is largely unfair. To be sure, Grant had his flaws, but both as a military commander and as US president after the American Civil War, he accomplished much during a very tumultuous and difficult period in the history of the United States. Grant's military record speaks for itself to a large extent. Early on, he gained some attention for his service during the US-Mexican War, but thereafter, owing to a number of personal motives, he drifted away from military service. The outbreak of the American Civil War, though, in 1861, brought him back into the field. In the early years of that conflict, he distinguished himself well enough to become one of the Union's senior commanders, and no one was as prominent as him in the final reduction of the Confederacy in 1864 and 1865. Many scholars have pointed to the overwhelmingly superior resources which Grant had at his disposal against Robert E. Lee in these closing stages of the war, and suggest that he could not really lose given these advantages. but several other Union generals had previously been given the same resources as Grant had in the last year or so of the war, and yet they had failed to defeat the Confederates. Conversely, Grant did, and there is no doubting his significance to the annals of the American Civil War. His post-war record as president is less well regarded than it might be. As the 18th President of the United States, he guided the country through the arduous early period of Reconstruction and economic stabilization in the aftermath of the war. He was successful enough that he was easily re-elected for a second term in the election of 1872. Moreover, Grant succeeded in reducing the power of groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, in the aftermath of the war, to a significant degree. Certainly, the Klan rose to become a very troubling aspect of American life again in future decades, but this was not Grant's fault. Furthermore, while his policies towards the Native Americans of the Plains ultimately ended in war in the mid-1870s, Grant's approach towards the Indians was relatively progressive for its time, and the Sioux War was as much the product of decades of Western expansionism as it was anything Grant did during his term in office. Finally, his role in resolving the crisis which ensued from the presidential election of 1876 needs to be considered and appreciated. Thus, we are left with a man who has been largely unfairly denigrated by subsequent generations. Grant was something of a contrarian, and certainly a heavy drinker throughout his life, but ultimately he navigated many of the difficulties and challenges he encountered as well as he could. There are a great many of America's presidents who are generally more favorably regarded than Grant, who, if they had been placed in his shoes between 1869 and 1877, might not have kept the ship of state on such an even keel in the aftermath of the only civil war the country has ever experienced. That is to his credit. What do you think of Ulysses S. Grant? Should he be primarily remembered for his role as a general in the American Civil War? Or is his legacy as President of the United States one which has been unfairly dismissed and forgotten? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as the Supreme Allied Commander, the hero of D-Day, and the 34th President of the United States, Dwight David Eisenhower, was born on the 14th of October 1890 in Denison, Texas. The third of 7 boys, Dwight acquired his more well-known nickname of Ike from his parents, who meant it to be a diminutive of their last name. Interestingly, all of the Eisenhower boys were called some variation of Ike when they were children, but only Dwight retained the nickname into his adulthood. His modest working-class upbringing and early educational career gave little hint of the grand accomplishments he would achieve in the coming decades. Eisenhower was descended from German, English, and Scottish immigrants to North America. His paternal ancestors had been German Protestant farmers who had emigrated to Pennsylvania during the 1740s. A branch of this family moved to Kansas during the 19th century, and there, at Lane University, David Eisenhower met his future wife, Ida Stover. The two were married in the autumn of 1885 and settled in the town of Hope, Kansas. The Eisenhowers opened a general store in Hope, and Ida gave birth to their first son, Arthur, the following year. Unfortunately, the family business failed, not only because of the economic downturn in American farming communities, but also due to the dishonest behavior and dealings of David's business partners. Now facing much poorer circumstances, the family was forced to relocate to Texas. Using his college education as an engineer, David secured employment on the Missouri-Texas-Kansas Railroad for a monthly wage of $40. The family rented a small house in Denison and began a slow financial recovery. During their few years in Texas, 2 more Eisenhower sons were born, Edgar and Dwight. In 1892, the family returned to Kansas, settling in Abilene. That year, Ida gave birth to the family's 4th son, Roy, and David became a mechanic for the Bell Springs Creamery, typically working 12-hour shifts, 6 days per week, and now earning $50 per month. The Eisenhowers thereafter put down their roots in Abilene, and Dwight always considered it his real hometown, despite having been born in Texas. David and Ida raised their 6 boisterous and competitive sons in a modest 800-square-foot house on the wrong side of the tracks in Abilene, but with enough land on their property to grow a few subsistence crops and keep a few animals. Combined with David's salary, the Eisenhower family were able to support themselves well enough. Dwight later reflected on his mostly happy childhood. "I never knew we were poor," he said. The values stressed at home were typical of the ethical culture of people of the American Plains regions: responsibility, hard work, faith, humility, modesty, honesty, and sincerity. In addition to their regular chores, each of the boys was assigned a plot of the family's property to cultivate crops, and each boy was responsible for selling the crops he produced to help support the family. David responded to any and all misbehavior on the part of his sons with firm discipline. Ike, more than occasionally, found himself in trouble for his hot and quick temper, which often landed him in fights with other boys in and out of school. Religion played an important role in the Eisenhowers' family life. David and Ida were members of the Mennonite sect, called the Brethren of Christ, also known as the River Brethren, for their practice of baptizing their followers in rivers. A religious shift took place in the Eisenhower house in the spring of 1895, when the whole family fell into deep mourning. The family's 5th son, Paul, died of diphtheria at only 10 months old. As often happens in response to tragedy, Ida's faith seems to have undergone an alteration following her son's death. Some months earlier, Ida had begun attending meetings of the International Bible Students Association, an organization that would later become known as the Jehovah's Witnesses. Following her son's death, Ida's association with this sect became more pronounced, and the Abilene chapter of this group began holding meetings regularly at the Eisenhower home. David and Ida encouraged their children in their religious education and observance, holding daily Bible study sessions as a family. Both David and Ida were pacifists, and Ida focused much attention on Dwight's religious development in an attempt to temper his fascination with the historical wars and struggles he so enjoyed reading about. By the time Dwight left home for college, he had read the entire Bible twice. Predictably, his command of Scripture remained formidable throughout his life. Yet while religion figured centrally in his childhood, Ike never actually joined a church himself. He never seemed to favor any particular Christian denomination either, though he had connections to the Presbyterian Church through his wife, Mamie. He described himself as a deeply religious man, but his religious sensibilities largely remained a private matter for him. Some historians speculate that this reticence to speak about religion might have been connected to his mother's religious affiliation. Some speculate that the Eisenhower sons, particularly Dwight, might have wanted to keep public discussion of their mother's religious practices muted for public relations purposes. The Jehovah's Witnesses were considered to be a rather radical fringe sect of millenarianism for much of the 20th century, and it is possible that the Eisenhower siblings, who all achieved and enjoyed impressive careers in law, banking, academia, engineering, healthcare, and the military, were keen to protect their family's reputation. Even John F. Kennedy, Eisenhower's presidential successor, was considered a controversial candidate for political office because of his Catholicism. In fact, America's current president, Joe Biden, is only the second Catholic and also only the second non-Protestant to hold the office of President of the United States. Abilene was typical of small-town America, a small city surrounded by a vast rural expanse. The Eisenhower children were therefore exposed to both city and country modes of life, although the rural experience was undoubtedly more familiar to them. Young Dwight developed a keen interest in the outdoors, particularly in hunting and fishing. At this particular time and place in America, life was tough for non-professionals and the working class, but most people firmly believed that hard work and honest dealings could eventually produce success, no matter where one started. Moreover, it was easier to achieve a modestly genteel prosperity in a town like Abilene than in a major urban or commercial center. Perhaps this sense of possibility and opportunity was part of the key to Ike's later confidence and success. For most of his early education, Ike was a fairly average student. He enjoyed his spelling and arithmetic lessons and became a voracious reader early in life. His mother Ida, a former teacher, had a decent collection of history books, and once Ike began reading them, history quickly became one of his favorite subjects, particularly military history. He pored over the military exploits of his favorite historical generals, including Hannibal and, predictably, George Washington. As a highly active and athletic boy, however, Ike was far more interested in football than anything else in his early academic career. The sheer physicality of the sport likely provided an outlet for Dwight's excessive energy and often quick temper. His love of the game and his desire to keep playing even caused him to risk his life at the age of 14. Ike had sustained a leg injury which led to a serious infection, for which his doctor recommended a leg amputation. Ike implored his parents to respect his decision to forego the amputation, even if the infection killed him. He preferred to take a chance that he might get better and retain the use of his legs. This would not be the first time that luck was demonstrably with him, and Ike made a full recovery, going on to play football in high school and college. Throughout his educational career, he continued to demonstrate fairly average academic performance overall, but retained his interest in history and reading. Western novels were a particular favorite of Ike's. He also showed an aptitude and interest in the practical applications of maths and sciences, which is unsurprising for the son of a college-educated engineer, as well as a man whose admirers would come to consider as a strategic and organizational genius. Ike's strategic thinking also manifested itself in his skill at card playing, a pursuit he continued to enjoy and to get better at throughout his life, particularly poker and bridge. His high school contemporaries predicted that Ike would enjoy a successful career as an Ivy League history professor. However, financial circumstances and personal inclinations guided Eisenhower in a vastly different direction. Dwight and his older brother Edgar graduated from Abilene High School together in 1909. Both wanted to go to college, but the family's income at the time was insufficient to pay tuition for two sons at once. Dwight and Edgar therefore agreed that Edgar would attend college first, while Dwight went to work at the creamery where their father worked. In this way, Dwight would help finance his brother's education, with the understanding that after Edgar graduated, he would do the same for Dwight. He spent more than a year working 6 days a week for a wage of $3 at the creamery. It was soon suggested to him that entering a military academy could secure him a tuition-free college education. Ike's long love affair with military history and his active, sometimes temperamental personality as a young man made him an ideal fit for such an institution. It would teach him structure, self-control, and the value of cooperation, all of which would be crucial to his later military and political roles. In 1911, with decent test scores and a recommendation from his congressman, Eisenhower was admitted to West Point Military Academy in New York. Eisenhower's college career was formative, and the experience he had there taught him much about the value of organization and calm, competent leadership. He started out less interested in becoming a military career man than in simply obtaining a college education and getting to play football at the same time. During his freshman year, Eisenhower even got the chance to confront the legendary Native American football player and Olympic gold medalist Jim Thorpe in the 1912 game between West Point and the Carlisle Institute, a Native American trade school. Seeking the glory of victory over the team who boasted America's foremost athlete at the time, Ike and several of his teammates focused their offensive on Thorpe in particular, hoping to bolster their team's advantage by taking him out of the game. Thorpe persevered through the onslaught, however, and Carlisle won the game. But this historic match was to be Eisenhower's last. He badly injured his knee following the game, with resulting permanent damage. Being no longer able to play football was a significant loss for Ike, but by his second year at West Point, he was coaching the junior varsity team and continued in this role until graduation. It is likely that coaching helped to foster the general in him rather than the soldier, and brought out the calm, competent, supportive, strategic, and organized side of him rather than the brash, impulsive, and sometimes aggressive side. Beyond his admittedly fulfilling role as football coach, Ike continued to be a decent, though not an excellent student. He took mostly science and technology courses, graduating 61st in a class of 164 students. He finished 10th in his class, however, in English and history, and was much admired for his eloquent writing. He had made the best of a college career which had largely not included playing football, a reality which had embittered him for a time. Ike began to smoke heavily by his second year at West Point and enjoyed as many poker games as he could, both prohibited activities at the academy. While his academic record was merely average, his discipline record was even less impressive, and he ranked 125th in discipline in a class of 164 students. Still, Eisenhower made lifelong friends in college and formed relationships that would one day figure in international importance. Many of the young men with whom he attended college would be tapped for high military command by the beginning of World War II. Popularly dubbed the class the stars fell on, no less than 59 graduates, roughly a third of West Point's class of 1915, went on to become generals, including 2 5-star generals, Eisenhower himself and Omar Bradley. Ike's life shifted significantly after graduation, and within a year his future military career had begun to take shape just as he met and fell in love with his future wife. Ike opted for the infantry after graduating from West Point and was posted to Fort Sam Houston near San Antonio, Texas. He was introduced to Mary Dowd, known as Mamie, soon after his arrival on the base. Mamie was the pretty, charming, and vivacious daughter of a wealthy family from Denver, Colorado. The Dowds owned a lucrative meatpacking company and spent the winters in Texas. He was just about the handsomest man I'd ever seen, Mamie later wrote about the fair-haired, blue-eyed man who would become her husband. Ike proposed to Mamie on Valentine's Day in 1916, and the two were married that July. Their first son, who they named Dowd, adorably nicknamed Ikey, was born the following year. Despite attempts to be posted overseas in a more active role, Eisenhower spent most of the next few years in junior officer training, coaching football for Peacock Military Academy and St. Louis College, training units and regiments, or serving in supply and logistics roles. His emerging organizational, administrative, and leadership qualities served him well through the First World War years, although he was repeatedly denied the opportunity to see any real military action. Eisenhower learned a great deal during this period, however, forming opinions about how the military of the future should be developed, both strategically and technologically. Like many other career military men of his day, Eisenhower saw the value of developing tanks and firepower rather than infantry offensives. He trained tank regiments in Georgia in 1917 and in Pennsylvania in 1918. In 1919, after being posted to Camp Meade, he helped orchestrate a transcontinental vehicle convoy from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, which taught him a great deal about tank and truck capabilities depending on terrain. This massive effort, involving hundreds of men and over 80 vehicles, was carried out with very little paved road to smooth the convoy's way, and there were literally dozens of breakdown events during the 3,200-mile, 62-day journey. The experience convinced him of the efficiency, productivity, and logistical benefits to be gleaned from the creation of a national highway system, which would later be a staple infrastructure program of his presidency. It wounded Ike's pride deeply that he had not been able to serve in a combat role in the war. He had finally received orders to depart for Europe with the unit he had finished training on the 18th of November 1918. However, exactly 1 week prior to the date of his departure, the armistice was announced. Ike was deeply disappointed. Conventionally, the way to establish a reputation and earn promotion in the military was through distinguished combat service, and Ike worried that his career might stagnate as a result of his never having served overseas. Yet it may have been a blessing in disguise, as few soldiers were prepared for the brutal savagery of the new, more technologically advanced warfare. The casualties were staggering, and the impact on the average soldier's mental health often debilitating. Instead, Eisenhower was lucky enough to spend the First World War years safely and contentedly with his young family and the friends he had made in the service. In 1920, Mamie and Ike, who had been staying with her parents off and on during the previous year, rejoined Ike at Camp Meade, Pennsylvania, where they settled into their new house on the base, right next door to George Patton, with whom Ike had quickly become friends. The two shared an enthusiasm for experimentation with military strategy and equipment, forming a personal and professional relationship that would continue through 3 decades and a world war. Tragedy struck in January 1921, however, when the 3-year-old Ike died after contracting scarlet fever. The child had caught the disease from a maid Ike and Mamie had hired, who had begun work in the Eisenhower household before she had fully recovered from her illness. Devastated, Ike and Mamie blamed themselves, and the tragedy had a profound impact on their marriage. Both grieved deeply and privately. Ike rarely spoke about his son's death, later writing, "This was the greatest disappointment and disaster in my life, the one I have never been able to forget completely." A year after Ike's passing, their second and only son, John, was born, and a sense of joy, comfort, and continuity began to return to the Eisenhower household once again. Every year, without fail, Ike sent Mamie flowers on the anniversary of Ike's death. Some of his biographers view Eisenhower's career during the interwar period as relatively stagnant, since he attained a rank no higher than lieutenant colonel prior to the beginning of World War II, when he was 51 years old. However, the 1920s and 1930s were, in fact, a highly productive learning period for Ike, when his more modern views on military development and his emerging promise as a leader, administrator, and strategist brought him to the attention of highly influential military men who mentored him and helped promote his career. Chief among them was General Fox Connor, whom Eisenhower met over dinner at George Patton's house at Camp Meade. Connor was impressed with Eisenhower, and having been appointed Army Chief of Staff by General Pershing, used his influence to have Ike appointed his executive officer in the Panama Canal Zone in 1922, where Connor commanded the 20th Infantry Brigade. Ike, Mamie, and baby John spent the next 2 years in Panama. The Canal Zone was a rather dreary and underdeveloped area, not the most stimulating environment for a new mother or her child. Being together was important for the Eisenhowers, however, and while it strained their marriage, Ike and Mamie coped as well as they could with family life and child-rearing under the stress of constant relocation and new, sometimes uncomfortable environments, as many career military families do. Fortunately, his duties as a staff officer in Panama were relatively light, and General Connor encouraged Ike to use the extra time to read extensively on history and philosophy, particularly military history and strategy. Eisenhower learned a great deal from Connor while serving as his executive officer, and came to understand that Connor took such a personal interest in him because of the general's conviction that another world war was coming. When it did, Connor knew that the Allies would need the ablest and best prepared men available to step into high command. Accordingly, as part of his tutelage, Connor shared his First World War experiences with Eisenhower, the tactics of battle, the successes and failures, the heavy decision-making involved in maintaining alliances and mobilizing men and resources. He expressed his grave concerns about the questionable soundness and potentially problematic nature of the Versailles Treaty as well. Eisenhower emerged from Connor's mentorship more confident in his perspectives and abilities, and prepared to excel more than ever before. After returning to Camp Meade in 1924, Eisenhower, thanks partly to General Connor's influence, was admitted to the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where he studied Army tactics and operations and the problem-solving involved in managing them. Completion of General Staff School was necessary to rise in the Army ranks, and a curriculum was notoriously grueling. No longer simply an average student, in 1926, Ike graduated first in a class of 275. Connor intervened once again in 1927 to have Eisenhower assigned to the American Battle Monuments Commission in Washington, D.C., where he was tasked by General Pershing with writing a narrative history of the American Expeditionary Forces service in Belgium and France during World War I. Later that year, he was admitted to the Army War College in D.C., where he once again graduated first in his class in 1928. Ike and Mamie spent the next year in France, where Eisenhower was commissioned to tour and produce a guide of the First World War battle sites in France. He was then assigned to the War Department in D.C. and tasked with developing plans and strategies for industrial mobilization should another major war break out. In 1930, he met the newly appointed Army Chief of Staff, Douglas MacArthur, whom he quickly impressed with his intelligence and competence. "This is the best damn officer in the Army," MacArthur once remarked about Eisenhower, and resolved, like General Connor before him, to promote Eisenhower's career. Like Connor, MacArthur believed another war would be on the horizon, and in terms of potential military leaders, Eisenhower was one of the most promising. Ike spent the 1930s working closely with MacArthur. As his assistant in Washington, Eisenhower helped to formulate policy and mobilization strategy for a potential upcoming war, according to MacArthur's vision. And in 1935, he accompanied the general to the Philippines, where MacArthur had been assigned to serve as military advisor to President Manuel Quezon. The Philippines were in a transitional period towards independence, and U.S. authorities were anxious that the region be defended from a potential invasion, which they worried might be launched by the Japanese. Eisenhower spent the next 4 years attempting to operationalize and implement MacArthur's plan for the Philippines' defense, one which required key regions to be reinforced using a citizen army properly trained to fight, and which could be carried out with limited support and resources from the United States. The task was daunting, and the odds of success seemed bleak, but Eisenhower dutifully pursued his assigned goals and did the best he could under the circumstances. Unfortunately, the Philippines would fall to the Japanese by 1942 anyway. What made Ike's experience in MacArthur's service much more difficult was the political infighting among the Americans stationed there and the personality clashes with MacArthur. But Ike had come a long way from being the hot-tempered young man spoiling for a fight. He had learned instead to compromise, conciliate, and negotiate. He was also noted for maintaining cordial relations with people he disagreed with, a skill he undoubtedly perfected in MacArthur's service. MacArthur was notorious for his irascible personality, and nearly a decade working with him effectively ruined all but the most professional part of the relationship between the two men. Eisenhower, however, proved to have truly mastered himself by having served so well under MacArthur. Ike's strong suit, going forward, would be his remarkable ability to deal diplomatically, patiently, and effectively with the many high-ranking Allied leaders and commanders, all of whom had to collaborate if they were to secure victory. And many of the Allied leaders and generals of the Second World War were famously difficult, even intolerable personalities. Churchill, de Gaulle, Stalin, Montgomery, and Patton, to name just a few, were all more than challenging to work with. And while they rarely expressed any unreserved approval of their international compatriots, virtually all had good things to say about Eisenhower, seeing him as infinitely competent, fair-minded, genuine, and trustworthy. By 1939, Ike was more than ready for a change, and he discreetly wrote to friends in Washington to help him find a new posting. He returned to Washington shortly after war was declared between Britain and Germany in September. He spent the next 2 years in multiple postings, both as a staff officer and in the field, advising and assisting in the expansion and mobilization of U.S. forces in preparation for a possible entry into World War II. He was given command of the Third Army and received acclaim and commendations for their successes against the Second Army in the 1941 War Games in Louisiana, after which he was promoted to Brigadier General. 5 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Secretary of War General George Marshall summoned Eisenhower to Washington and appointed him to head the War Plans Division, eventually giving him command of all U.S. forces in the European theater. It is possible that Ike had been shuffled around in so many different postings in the 2 years leading to U.S. entry into the war because his performance in various roles was being carefully watched. Apparently, Marshall had decided that Ike was most valuable for his ability to plan, organize, and facilitate the execution of effective military policy and maneuvers. As Secretary of War, Marshall could not afford to promote men who would need to be micromanaged. Marshall needed eminently competent, responsible, accountable generals to whom he could delegate charge of the various large-scale operations and who would act confidently and independently in the moment when necessary. With his 2+ decades of experience, Eisenhower fitted the bill perfectly. Yet he now had a greater task before him than he had ever faced, and with little notion of just how great his challenges would be by the last months of the European theatre. Eisenhower departed for London in June of 1942. Ike arrived in England with his work cut out for him. Not only nationalistic rivalry, but also unease and distrust clouded the interactions between the Allied military and political leaders. This made planning and cooperation challenging, but communicating effectively with prickly personalities and encouraging many conflicting elements to work together was Eisenhower's strong suit. He was given command of the Allied invasion of North Africa, launched in November of 1942. Accompanying Ike to North Africa was a pretty 33-year-old Irish divorcee named Kay Summersby. She had been assigned to Eisenhower as a driver after his arrival in London, and she remained with him as his personal secretary for the duration of the war. The nature of the relationship between Eisenhower and Summersby has been the subject of much historical controversy and debate. Away from the front, World War II was a very flirtatious time, and numerous members of the American military, both young privates and great generals, formed romantic relationships with British women. Ike and Kay clearly liked each other a great deal, but the exact nature of their relationship has never been fully clarified. Rumors abounded that they were having an affair, and that Eisenhower would seek a divorce. However, Ike gave no sign of any such thing in the more than 300 letters he wrote to his wife Mamie while he was overseas. After Eisenhower's death, Kay published a memoir in which it was claimed that, while there was a romance between them, they had never slept together. Whatever the truth of their relationship, Ike cut ties with Kay when the war was over, returning home to his wife and son. Eisenhower's first major challenge in the Second World War was the North African theatre, and while the operation was ultimately a success, it was also plagued by missed opportunities, logistics problems, and painful mistakes. Ike ruefully observed that students at the General Staff College in Washington would be criticizing American performance in North Africa for decades to come. However, the general learned important lessons during the campaign, which he would carry forward with him through subsequent challenges. Operation Torch was the largest amphibious invasion in military history up until that time, and pitted General Eisenhower against the Desert Fox, General Erwin Rommel. Rommel's forces had been struggling against the British 8th Army, led by General Montgomery, in the Western Desert Campaign. The Allies took 3 key ports on the northwest coast, Oran, Casablanca, and Algiers, before proceeding east toward Tunisia. The 8th Army, in turn, marched west, and by May 1943, the Tunisian campaign ended with the surrender of the Axis forces. Most were of the opinion that the North African theatre of operations had continued for much longer than it should have. Eisenhower had been too cautious to proceed on multiple occasions, and had not dealt decisively enough with personnel issues or supply problems. Although the Allies took over 250,000 German prisoners of war and were left in command of the field, Rommel and the bulk of his German forces had escaped. Eisenhower would confront the Desert Fox again, next time on the Western Front. One of Ike's greatest strengths was his ability to learn from his mistakes. Going forward, he resolved to act more decisively and to fine-tune all logistical and personnel relationships. He got tougher on himself as well as on the men serving under him, who nonetheless thought highly of him. Ike was not the inspirational sort of general. Many of the most admired generals were highly charismatic, temperamental men who inspired gut-level loyalty for their abilities, but often had near intolerable personalities and diva-like attitudes. Eisenhower had famously had to interfere in a disciplinary scandal to keep the near-indispensable Patton from a court-martial after the abrasive general, disgusted at their shows of emotion, had physically assaulted 2 shell-shocked soldiers. Ike was not a fiery, charismatic sort, but he was admired for being plain-spoken, respectful, compassionate, and a conciliator who never tried to dodge responsibility when the failure was his. His troops may not have viewed him in the same worshipful light as generals like Patton or Montgomery, but they knew that General Eisenhower cared about them. The kind of diva squabbling, which Eisenhower notably avoided as a general, actually impeded the progress of Operation Husky, when Patton and Montgomery seemed more interested in competing with one another in an absurdly nationalistic display during the invasion of Sicily, rather than cooperating in a swift takeover of the island so that they could press the Allied advantage. Their respective armies competed in a race to take Messina. Meanwhile, the Axis powers managed to evacuate 100,000 men, 10,000 vehicles and 17,000 tons of supplies with which to reinforce and defend the Italian mainland. The Allies would thus quite literally face an uphill battle, all the way up the Italian boot, to secure victory. In fact, the fascists in Italy held out even after the fall of Berlin in 1945, as the war was coming to an end. In December 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt selected Eisenhower to plan and orchestrate the invasion of Western Europe, codenamed Operation Overlord, on what has become known popularly as D-Day. For most historians and general admirers of Eisenhower, this was his magnum opus, his greatest achievement. Knowing that 60 German divisions, commanded by his old foe Rommel, were waiting for him, Eisenhower assiduously planned and organized these last stages of the war's long struggle, trying to provide for every eventuality and implementing lessons he had learned about collaboration, delegation, strategy, logistics, and maneuvers during his 30-year military career.
And now from our sponsor, Call of War, the cross-platform, real-time grand strategy game in which you choose a real country to lead during World War II. Simply click the Call of War link in the video description to start playing today. Take command of your own nation, build up your resources, and equip your army ready to fight up to 100 other players. Expand and defend your country over weeks of multiplayer gameplay using historic maps and varying scenarios, moving in real time over different terrains. Develop your secret weapons to control the battlefield and become a war hero in the process. Defend your country by building alliances, choose your own strategy, and perfect your own technological strategy to win the war. You get an exclusive gift. Click on the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Offer only available for 30 days. Don't lose time. Play this sensational strategy game of life and death on the battlefield. Try out Call of War for free now.
The Germans knew that the Allies would attack Western Europe via the English Channel, but they did not know exactly where or when the attack would come. Having learned the importance of preserving the element of surprise from the North African and Italian campaigns, Eisenhower determined to cripple Axis supply lines in a preliminary bombing campaign before invading France. To keep the Germans guessing as to his real strategy, Eisenhower planned 2 other fake invasions at alternate locations on the French coast to keep the Germans away from the site where the Allies planned to strike. These mock invasions even featured inflatable tanks and parachuting dummies, which kept the far-flung German divisions along the Atlantic Wall confused for weeks after the initial landings while the Allied invasion continued. The deception campaign was truly elaborate. The Allies airdropped thin strips of metal to interfere with German radar communications. They created fake radio and code traffic which they allowed the enemy to intercept, and they sent in double agents to pose as Axis spies who fed the enemy erroneous intelligence about Allied plans and movements. Still the largest amphibious invasion in military history, the D-Day landings involved 156,000 Allied troops from the British, American and Canadian forces, who established a beachhead around 10 miles deep into occupied territory. Here, Eisenhower gave Patton and his troops free rein to promptly and furiously begin to break through the German lines. In a matter of weeks, the Allies had landed 2 million more troops, tens of thousands of vehicles, and untold amounts of supplies. The westward push across Europe began. Eisenhower now had no reticence about proceeding, both decisively and aggressively. But the Germans would make one last stand, one that threatened to potentially tip the scales back in their favor, long enough for them to regroup. The Battle of the Bulge. By the fall of 1944, Hitler had quite clearly and correctly anticipated that Germany would soon be overrun and occupied. The Soviets were closing in from the east, and the rest of the Allied forces were advancing on Germany from the west. In an attempt to deal the Allies a blow deadly enough to forestall the Western invasion, the Germans launched a last, desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes region of northern France and Belgium. Hitler's goal was to force an Allied retreat westward to get enough divisions across the Meuse River to take Antwerp and thereby cripple the Allied supply lines, forcing them to sign a peace with Germany. Then perhaps they might have a chance of defeating the Soviets. As things stood, the Germans could not continue fighting a multi-front war. The Battle of the Bulge was highly crucial to the war's ultimate outcome. Troops on both sides were exhausted and experiencing continuous supply problems. Both Allied and Axis leaders understood that the winners of this battle would, in all likelihood, win the war. The surprise offensive came in December of 1944. The Germans sent in 400,000 men, nearly twice as many troops as the Allies to the west, and roughly 10% more tanks. Accordingly, the Germans initially showed significant success, pushing the British and American troops back toward the west, encircling and besieging Allied-held towns, with two divisions advancing as far as a mere 5 miles from the Meuse River. This early success was partly attributable to the winter weather conditions in the region, which prevented Allied air power from providing support. But once the weather lifted in January, American and British planes took to the skies once again and devastated the German supply lines. What was left of the German Air Force spent itself trying to destroy the Allied supply lines as well. But it was too late. In desperation, the German panzer divisions flung themselves at the enemy, hoping for a victory before remaining supplies collapsed. General Eisenhower, however, orchestrated a brilliant and valiant defense in key locations in the Ardennes region, and the Allies held out until the Germans were forced to retreat. They had suffered nearly as many casualties as the Allies. The war appeared to be all but over, bar the mopping up. Most historians and history buffs will immediately point to D-Day as Eisenhower's greatest achievement, which is hard to argue. There was, after all, something almost supernatural about the level of intricacy involved in the venture. The Bulge, however, was Eisenhower's only real test as a field commander on the ground. The glory he had sought and been denied by being kept stateside during the First World War was now his to claim, and in a moment when it truly counted. Consequently, some historians see the Battle of the Bulge as an achievement that was as significant for Eisenhower as the execution of the D-Day landings. Following the German surrender, Eisenhower remained in Europe to help oversee the Allied occupation and to organize the investigation and documentation necessary for the Nuremberg trials. According to American policy, which viewed most of the German people as victims of the Nazi regime, Eisenhower made efforts to ensure an adequate supply of food to support the local populace and labor to help repair necessary infrastructure. He also placed a heavy emphasis on the thorough documentation of the death camps, commissioning extensive photographic and video evidence, and not just to serve as evidence for the Nuremberg trials. The grisly and haunting spectacle of the camps had utterly horrified Eisenhower. What had taken place in these facilities was so hideous as to be almost unbelievable, and he correctly anticipated that, in future, propagandists might use people's unwillingness to believe that such extreme crimes were possible in order to deny the reality of the Holocaust. Eisenhower finally returned home in the summer of 1945 to a hero's welcome. With the recent death of President Roosevelt prior to the end of the war, Ike was now the most popular man in America, and many influential friends were urging him to enter the presidential race for the 1948 election, including President Truman himself, who even offered to serve as Ike's running mate if Eisenhower joined the Democrats. The fact of his high military office and lack of political experience, however, made him wary of entering the race, believing it might hint at military dictatorship. Additionally, the prospect of political office seemed daunting to a 56-year-old man who might prefer a less demanding occupation after his wartime exertions. Instead, Eisenhower was offered the position of president at the prestigious Columbia University, which he gladly accepted in 1948. Later that year, he published his World War II memoir, Crusade in Europe, which was an immediate bestseller. For the first time in his life, Eisenhower was a man of means. Ike had mixed experiences during his 2 years at Columbia. He founded the Institute of War and Peace Studies to research the causes and consequences of armed conflict. He also established an informal council on foreign relations to deliberate on important foreign policy initiatives. The opportunities for meaningful interaction with political, military, and intellectual leaders, therefore, made Ike's time at Columbia a rich experience in many ways. However, he did not get as many opportunities to participate in the formulation of educational policy, or to engage directly with the students and faculty as much as he wished. Moreover, the academic establishment at the university sometimes made him feel less than welcome. Some members of the tenured faculty tended to look down their noses at Eisenhower for what they perceived as his rusticity, his lack of sophistication, such as his literary preference for dime store Western novels. As well as this, his relative lack of involvement in the daily educational life of the university stoked some resentment towards him as university president. In 1950, he resigned his post at Columbia and departed once again for Europe, this time serving as the Supreme Commander of the NATO alliance. Eisenhower spent the next year advising America's European allies and helping to build a broad and powerful military coalition which could stand against the rising forces of communism, provide a bulwark to defend democracies, and present enough united force to discourage the outbreak of future wars. Upon his return to the US in 1951, he made an eloquent appeal to Congress, convincing the typically isolationist legislative body to offer firm support for the NATO alliance. With unprecedented grassroots support for an Eisenhower presidency growing across the country, President Truman once again approached Eisenhower, offering to support his candidacy as a Democrat. Eisenhower, who had never voted or publicly aired any political opinion or affiliation up until this time, declined, finally declaring himself to be a Republican. This was the beginning of a permanent and bitter rift between Truman and Eisenhower, which only worsened through the 1952 election campaign season. Ike's political declaration inspired a draft Eisenhower movement in the Republican Party. Understanding that his opponent for the party nomination, Robert A. Taft, had far less concern for foreign than for domestic policy, and that all of his work for international security might be at risk in a more isolationist America, Ike finally decided to throw his hat into the ring. "I like Ike" buttons were suddenly everywhere, and enthusiastic voters could be heard humming the unavoidably catchy television jingle, also called "I Like Ike," under their breath. Ike's campaign was notably populist in its character, which is odd since Eisenhower himself was nothing of the sort, and if left to his own devices, likely would have campaigned simply on his established record of sober, calm, competent leadership and administration. He achieved an impressive victory over the Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson in November of 1952, winning the votes from every state in the Electoral College except for the South, and winning 55% of the popular vote. He would repeat this success even more impressively in the election of 1956, achieving a landslide victory over Stevenson a second time. While he was one of the oldest presidents elected in many decades, Ike continued to be an active man. As president, he was committed and hard-working, while still knowing how to delegate, and he continued to pursue his hobbies and interests, including his reading, his poker, and bridge games, attending baseball and football games, and a rather more recently acquired passion, landscape painting, which, he was surprised to find, he was rather good at. Eisenhower's two-term presidency featured massive economic growth, social change, and increasing international tension. Ike is generally thought of as a president more concerned with foreign policy than domestic, and he certainly gave top priority to unfolding events in the Cold War world. However, his reticence to encroach on constitutional conventions such as the self-determination of states and the separation of powers has been interpreted by some as a lack of concern for serious social issues, particularly civil rights. Eisenhower had insisted on campaigning in the segregationist South, trying to win both white and black voters. He refused to condemn the segregationists outright, but promptly implemented the full desegregation of Washington, D.C., all U.S. armed forces, and the Foreign Service. He encouraged increased recruitment of African Americans to government positions, and privately deplored the attempts of white supremacists to keep black people from voting. Hearing about the attacks on black Americans who achieved economic success in the South infuriated him, but he would not take a more activist role in the cause of civil rights or anti-racism. This deeply disappointed many black voters and civil rights leaders, particularly when Eisenhower refused to comment publicly on the brutal and racially motivated murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till in Mississippi in 1955, or the bombing of Dr. Martin Luther King's house the following year. several subsequent presidents have been far more outspoken about racist extremism and hate crimes, and been more openly supportive of civil rights. The way Ike saw it, bold action on civil rights might produce immediate change, but might also prove destabilizing if change occurred too quickly. He also did not believe that he could, as president, usurp the legislative prerogatives of Congress. He could dismantle the structural racism of segregation within the federal jurisdiction, but it was up to Congress to pass comprehensive civil rights legislation, a Congress which the Republicans had lost once again to the Democrats in 1954, and which they had held by only the slimmest margins to begin with. Eisenhower could, however, appoint Supreme Court justices with civil rights leanings, and accordingly appointed 2 of them to the bench, including Chief Justice Earl Warren, whose judicial opinion in the Brown v. Board of Education case finally struck down the segregationist Plessy v. Ferguson. Further, Eisenhower did not hesitate to enforce the Brown decision in the South when they refused to cooperate and allow school desegregation to go forward. He assumed control of the Arkansas National Guard to force the racial integration of Little Rock High School in 1957. Previously, Eisenhower had quietly negotiated with the Arkansas governor, Orville Forbes, to ensure that the integration would go ahead peacefully, and was infuriated when the governor went back on his word. National Guard troops remained on the Little Rock High School campus for several weeks, escorting the 9 black students safely to and from their classes in an overwhelming and often hostile sea of white students. Eisenhower's civil rights record also received criticism for his continued implementation of Native American assimilationist policies. Native American leaders charged that the Eisenhower administration's Indian policy to remove Native Americans from federal jurisdiction and abolish the reservation system threatened their culture and way of life. They accused Washington of continuing to abuse centuries-old treaty agreements and force all tribes, who each saw themselves as distinct nations, to become Americans, which previous administrations had been trying to do for decades. Eisenhower was also criticized for his failure to condemn the blatantly unconstitutional attacks on people suspected of communist ties during the Red Scare campaign of Senator Joseph McCarthy. Those who suffered under Joseph McCarthy's witch hunt among federal government employees likewise criticized Eisenhower for failing to openly condemn McCarthy for his unconstitutional attacks on privacy and free speech. Anyone with any documented communist leanings was targeted, but so too were civil rights activists, whom many authorities associated with a sympathy for communism. The gay and lesbian community were also targeted in these attacks, not for their political affiliation, but because their so-called lack of moral fiber left them open to blackmail by communist spies, making them untrustworthy. This mass firing of gay and lesbian employees from government positions is remembered as the Lavender Scare and was instrumental in awakening a nascent gay liberation movement, which found much louder expression by the late 1960s. While Eisenhower loathed McCarthy personally, he made no move to curtail his campaign against domestic communism, except when McCarthy attempted to start issuing congressional subpoenas to White House staff members. In response, Eisenhower was the first president to both invoke and fully define the principle of executive privilege. As far as Ike was concerned, overall political stability and national security were best served by keeping certain access to the executive branch on a privileged basis, especially from someone as ruthless, dishonest, and opportunistic as McCarthy. As president, Eisenhower is most frequently praised for presiding over one of the largest economic expansions in American history and helping the nation achieve some of the world's best quality of life outcomes. The American automobile, construction, retail, and service industries all exploded in the aftermath of World War II. Unemployment levels reached historic lows. An unprecedented number of American families bought cars, homes, and numerous other consumer goods, and began to take annual vacations. American productivity and job creation owed much to World War II. Industries continued to benefit from infrastructure built during the war, such as the automobile industry. Democratic Party members claimed that their New Deal programs and GI Bill, which Ike had no hand in, were key factors in America's healthy post-war economy. There is truth in these claims. Ike did not pioneer the farming subsidy programs, the Social Security Administration, or the infrastructure to promote fair labor practices. He was not responsible for the GI Bill, which helped former soldiers and their families reach the economic equilibrium necessary to participate in the booming economy. However, Eisenhower did work to help facilitate the economic expansion in multiple ways. He disentangled private industries from government finances, many of whom had become accustomed to receiving hefty government paychecks during the war for producing whatever was needed for the war effort. He also allowed tax rates for top earners, capital gains, and the wealthiest estates to remain high, a decidedly unconservative decision which brought him into conflict with members of his own party. A surplus of tax revenue allowed him to expand Social Security programs to benefit an additional 10 million American workers, providing them with access to unemployment, insurance, and pensions. Ike had never been the New Deal's biggest fan, particularly in his younger years. In fact, it was his exposure to Roosevelt's administration in Washington during the 1930s which hardened his largely conservative outlook. But by the 1950s, he was under no illusions about the benefits of the basic social welfare state. Any political party who tried to get rid of the New Deal programs now, he said, would never be heard from again. He described those who still aimed to deconstruct the New Deal as a negligible and stupid splinter group. Finally, one of Eisenhower's most significant contributions to America's economic expansion was his pioneering of the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. Originally envisioned as a quick evacuation solution from densely populated urban areas in the event of a nuclear attack, the creation of the nationwide highway system opened up national markets for trade and shipping, put small towns on the map, allowing them to grow, encouraged interstate leisure travel, and facilitated the creation of businesses to serve all highway travelers. Eisenhower's America enjoyed the world's highest standard of living during the 1950s. When it came to foreign policy, Ike faced the daunting task of representing America on the world stage at the dawn of the nuclear era. His perspectives on both communism and nuclear weapons had evolved since the end of World War II. Ike had been in Russia when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. He had been horrified, believing it had done more harm than good. The Japanese, he thought, had been close enough to surrender to make the use of the atomic bomb unnecessary, although some historians continue to disagree on this point. He found it repugnant that the United States had been the first to use nuclear weapons. He was also of the opinion that the atomic bomb had done more than anything to make the Soviets distrust the Americans, leading to increasing tensions in the years ahead. Eisenhower was still hopeful during the immediate post-war period, believing that Russia wanted friendship more than competition with the United States. By 1948, however, the Russians had tested their first atomic bomb, and tensions over Germany's economic recovery and Greece's civil war had risen considerably. The Soviets seemed bent on expansion, and Ike's stance on communism therefore hardened. He began to believe, as his Republican contemporaries did, that an overall policy of containment, backed by the threat of military action or nuclear strike, was the best path to secure American interests and continued world peace. Impressions of Eisenhower's handling of the Cold War continue to vary. Modern critics mostly condemn the activities of the CIA, which Eisenhower approved during his administration, including the overthrow of elected governments in Iran and Guatemala, charging that these operations had less to do with containing communism than installing governments more friendly to US economic interests. These actions made Iranian oil accessible to US and British companies and prevented the nationalization and equitable distribution of land among Guatemalans to facilitate the dominance of large-scale, corporate, American agricultural interests in the region. Containment of communism in Latin America and the Middle East continued to be a feature of American foreign policy in the years to come. The Eisenhower Doctrine, which offered military support to Middle Eastern countries determined to resist Soviet communism, profoundly affected the stability and geopolitics of the Middle East region during Eisenhower's presidency. He was praised for his contribution to solving the Suez Crisis in Egypt, but overall, American policy in the Middle East has frequently been criticized for being at cross purposes with Arab countries, who viewed Zionist imperialism as a far greater threat than communism, and who deeply resented American and British support for Israel. In principle, Eisenhower was more in favor of liberating communist countries than in containing them. But he understood that one could not constantly go to war in this new age of warfare. This is evident in his handling of the Korean War, his subsequent strategy of nuclear brinkmanship with Communist China, and his policy in Southeast Asia. The death of Stalin greatly facilitated the resolution of the Korean War, as it left a temporary power vacuum which rendered China more vulnerable to US military threats, which Eisenhower did not hesitate to employ to force China to withdraw from the Korean peninsula. Subsequently, Eisenhower was instrumental in formulating the US policy of support for Taiwan against encroachments by Red China. Unwilling to commit more than funding and military advisors to the defense of French Indochina, later South Vietnam, Eisenhower's initially minimal commitment to defeating communism in Vietnam would eventually snowball, under the subsequent Kennedy and Johnson administrations, into an arduous and undeclared war that would take the lives of 50,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese troops and civilians. Kennedy also inherited the task of executing the Bay of Pigs invasion, planned by the Eisenhower administration, which spiraled into the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Because Ike's foreign policy discouraged the pursuit of all-out war, his strategy for dealing with an expansion of Soviet influence and nuclear capability involved intricate negotiation and the building and maintenance of America's own nuclear arsenal and capabilities. Admirers of Eisenhower praise his efforts at nuclear disarmament, however unsuccessful they may have proven to be. When the Soviets exploded their first hydrogen bomb, Eisenhower went against the advice of his cabinet to propose mutual nuclear disarmament with the Soviets. The campaign was called Atoms for Peace and suggested that the two superpowers might agree to decommission their weapons, using them instead to create nuclear power plants for the benefit of both countries. Ike consistently tried to avoid the one-upmanship of the arms race with the Soviets, but also did not hesitate to enlarge the US nuclear stockpile as the Russian arsenal increased. Eisenhower's open skies policy and proposed mutual inspections were also met with Russian refusal. Ultimately, neither side was willing to be the first to establish real trust by disarming first, or by being the first to permit UN-supervised nuclear inspections. The Eisenhower administration was significantly embarrassed by the U-2 incident, when they approved one last illegal and covert surveillance flight of the Soviet Union prior to a summit with the Russians. Khrushchev promptly produced the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, whose plane had been shot down over Soviet airspace, and who confirmed that Eisenhower had lied when he denied the existence of the U-2 flight. Furious at Ike's unabashed refusal to apologize for the incident, Khrushchev promptly cancelled the summit and rescinded Eisenhower's invitation to visit the Soviet Union. Throughout his presidency, Eisenhower grew to resent the absurdly high price tag for America's foreign policy. He had massively defunded America's conventional military forces and poured money into the development of a nuclear strategy which paradoxically kept Americans safe using the principle of assured mutual destruction. The space race eventually came to seem excessive to him as well, and Ike referred to any administration that could spend $40 billion on a race to the moon as nuts. Ike reached the end of his presidency, concerned above all about what he referred to as the military-industrial complex, and its potential to hijack and erode American democracy. He had tried hard to end the excessive allocation of government and military funding to private companies after World War II, but in the thick of the arms race with the Soviets, he had not been able to prevent weapons manufacturers, who grew more powerful every year, from claiming an increasingly enormous share of American tax money for the weapons they produced. When his presidency was over, Eisenhower handed the reins of government to Kennedy, who had emerged victorious against Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's vice president in the 1960 election. Accompanied by Secret Service detail, Ike and Mamie departed the White House for their farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Ike's retirement was both pleasant and fairly active. It meant much more time with Mamie and their son John and their grandchildren. He wrote 3 more memoirs between 1963 and 1967 and continued his hobbies and pursuits, including poker, bridge, landscape painting, and a rather newer hobby for him, golfing. He also continued his support for Republican electoral candidates in his retirement. Eisenhower's health had begun failing as early as 1955, when he had his first heart attack, although Vice President Nixon and Eisenhower's cabinet had done everything possible to minimize the president's health problems to the media. Ike suffered no less than 4 more heart attacks over the next 10 years, the last of which left him fairly debilitated, and he was permanently hospitalized by 1968. Dwight Eisenhower died of heart failure on the 28th of March 1969 at the age of 78. His coffin lay in state in the rotunda of Washington's Capitol building for several days before he was laid to rest in his beloved hometown of Abilene, Kansas, in the grounds of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. He is buried next to his wife, Mamie, and their beloved first son, Ike. Like most other globally prominent figures of the 20th century, probably the most turbulent century of the modern period, Eisenhower has a complicated and frequently debated legacy. As one of the greatest heroes among the Allies in the Second World War, Eisenhower's contributions to victory give him indisputable historical importance and place him shoulder to shoulder with the Allies' greatest generals like Montgomery and Patton, and alongside political leaders like Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, and de Gaulle in terms of his influence. It is therefore interesting that while biographies of Eisenhower began to appear almost immediately following the end of World War II, and many more have been published in the decades since, Ike is in fact a great deal less visible in popular culture, iconography, and historical biography compared to these other prominent personages. Historians documenting his political record during the 1960s and immediately following his death were fairly critical of his presidency, particularly his silence or relative inaction on civil rights issues, or what they perceived as his limited success in preventing escalation of the Cold War. By the late 1970s and 80s, however, the conservative tide of politics had risen once again in the West, and new perspectives were offered by historians seeking to rehabilitate Eisenhower's reputation from the criticisms of earlier historians. Many of these more conservative historians attributed greater political skill to Eisenhower than he had previously been credited with. Eisenhower post-revisionists agree with this assessment, but criticize his performance as a political party leader, accusing him of failing to cultivate unity within the Republican Party or to sufficiently support Nixon in the 1960 election against Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy. This seesaw of historical perspectives continues, yet Eisenhower consistently continues to rank among the top 10 best US presidents across multiple polling sources. His greatest admirers continue to tout his presidency as a period of exceptional economic and infrastructural development, and affirm that with Ike at the tiller, the NATO alliance held, communism remained fairly well contained, and the Cold War remained cold. Some go as far as crediting Eisenhower with the prevention of a Third World War. Deeper research and examination of this fascinating man is certainly called for. Although many commentators have judged his politics as significantly right-wing, Ike himself claimed to represent, in his own words, a political philosophy of progressive conservatism, dedicated to improving productivity, efficiency, and quality of life, while maintaining both overall fiscal and political stability. This kind of blended, moderate political perspective would almost certainly enjoy dubious popularity in modern America's current atmosphere of polarization and political and cultural tribalism. Perhaps most worthy of additional study is the fascinating dual role Eisenhower played by helping to promulgate the age of hyper-militarism and nuclear weapons, sometimes wittingly and sometimes unwittingly, while simultaneously trying to forestall and/or deconstruct it. The complexities of this legacy continue both to cement and to complicate international relationships today. Above all, Eisenhower's story is one which resonates strongly among those who believe in the concept of the American dream. The poor boy from rural small-town America, no more remarkable than any other boy, had become one of modern history's greatest military heroes and had twice been elected president. What do you think of Dwight D. Eisenhower? Was he a weak party leader who shied away from many important issues of his day? Or was he one of the greatest generals of the Second World War, whose leadership qualities made him a renowned and well-loved president? Please let us know in the comments below. And as always, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as Richard Milhous Nixon was born on the 9th of January 1913 in Yorba Linda, California, to a poor family of Quaker descent, the second of 5 boys. Richard's father was Francis Anthony Nixon, known as Frank, who was born on the 2nd of December 1878 in Elk Township, Ohio, to Samuel Brady Nixon and Sarah Ann Wadsworth. Although raised as a Methodist, Quakerism ran in his family. When his mother died of tuberculosis in his last year of elementary education, Frank was forced to quit school to help support his impoverished family. He held a variety of jobs, including working as a potato farmer and sheep shearer, as well as a streetcar motorman or driver in Columbus, Ohio. In 1907, he decided to move to sunny Southern California after getting frostbite. Once in California, he found employment as a driver on the Pacific Electric streetcar line, which ran from Los Angeles to Whittier. In 1908, Frank met Hannah Elizabeth Milhous at a community party. She was born on the 7th of March 1885 in Butlerville, Indiana, to Franklin Milhous and Almira Park Burge, who were dedicated Quakers. Hannah's family moved to Whittier, California in 1897 when she was only 12. They chose Whittier because of its strong Quaker community. Hannah was enrolled in Whittier College when she met Frank Nixon, and following their courtship, they married in 1908 and went on to have 5 boys. Apart from Richard, there was Harold Samuel, born in 1909, Francis Donald, born in 1914, Arthur Burge, born in 1918, and Edward Calvert, born in 1930. Hannah proved to be a quiet but powerful influence on Richard. He often referred to her as a saint. Richard grew up in a difficult, strict household where Frank's terrible temper sometimes resulted in violent outbursts accompanied by whippings and similar punishments. Hannah's frosty, controlling silences made finding love and comfort for any child difficult. For Richard, this tense atmosphere fashioned his relentless drive to gain approval that would later take him to the top of both national and world politics. From an early age, Richard was a quiet, bookish child. Often sick as an infant, he never gained the athletic prowess expected of male children of the day. However, his more sedentary nature proved an opportunity to gain praise from his parents on other fronts. Throughout his youth, he became a good student and excelled at music, playing both violin and piano. He proved so proficient at music that, as a teenager, he debated whether he should study law or pursue music. Yet politics would become his first love, especially after he became student president of his 8th grade class. In high school, he was one of those kids that everyone looked up to. He was a straight-A student, won awards for oratory, participated in the debate team, performed in drama club shows, played violin in the school orchestra, and even earned a place on the junior varsity football team. In addition to these achievements, he helped support his family by working in his father's grocery store and gas station. Yet Richard Nixon suffered setbacks as well. He lost his bid to be student body president at Whittier High School to a more popular boy from a wealthier family. This began a lifelong obsession with being resentful of members of the elite class. His family also experienced trauma. He was devastated by the sudden death of his brother Arthur of tubercular encephalitis in 1925. 2 years later, family life came to a sudden stop when Harold returned from boarding school in New England sick with tuberculosis. His mother took Harold to Arizona, hoping the desert air would cure the disease. It did not, and 6 years later, while Richard was in college, Harold died. Both deaths affected him deeply and created the sense of a ticking clock he had to outrace. His grandmother bolstered this sentiment by giving him a gift of a framed portrait of Abraham Lincoln to hang over his bed. On the back, she wrote down the words to a Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem, Psalms of Life. It became a mantra for Richard's life, especially the verse, "Lives of great men oft remind us, we can make our lives sublime, and departing, leave behind us footprints on the sands of time." Richard resolved to succeed no matter what, so he could leave his footprints on the sands of time. In so many ways, Richard exemplified the 20th century, a time of great turmoil and social, technological, and cultural change. His early life began just as so many technologies we take for granted in the 21st century were either in development or on the verge of invention, including automobiles, aircraft, radio, television, telecommunications, computers, motion pictures, enhanced factory production, mass market distribution, and even the control of nuclear fission. Science rose to prominence during this century, leading to extraordinary developments such as humans traveling to the moon and probes penetrating deep space, sending information back that transformed our understanding of the Earth's place in the vast universe. The photo, now known as Earthrise, showing a little blue marble in a sea of black, taken by astronaut William Anders on Apollo 8 in 1968, did much to open people's eyes to the fragility of the Earth and helped galvanize movements to stop the careless squandering of its resources, giving rise to efforts to end further environmental devastation. The world was getting smaller and more interconnected. The speed and reach of transportation and communication systems expanded to an international scale. Society also changed dramatically with the rise of self-made men who competed with the established elites for power. Female societal roles shifted out of the home, with more women becoming college-educated and not only working outside the home, but also entering leadership roles in once male-dominated arenas such as politics, science, business, and the military. Although children continued to work to support their families in the early part of the century, increasingly their days focused on attending school. Yet, not everything was so inspiring. With the growth of factories and mass market distribution came conflicts over the rights of labor against management. Strikes and lockouts, sometimes violent, became common. Marxist communism was rising in influence, claiming to give voice to often powerless people against the elite. In some countries, communism often rolled into totalitarian regimes that posed a threat to democracy elsewhere. Fascism in Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan presented a similar threat, but from a nationalistic perspective. Europe, Asia, and Africa were torn apart not only by 2 world wars, but also smaller regional conflicts in Asia, Africa, South America, and the Middle East. Genocides killed thousands and displaced millions throughout the century. What haunted the world most during the latter half of this era was the spectre of the atom bomb, first used on Japan to end World War II. It could, if used wantonly, destroy humanity. The epic struggle between the 2 great political systems, communism and capitalism, that became known as the Cold War, dominated geopolitical actions for 40 years. It was during this time that Richard graduated 3rd in his class at Whittier High School in June 1930. Because of his academic achievements, the Harvard Club of California awarded him the Outstanding All-Round Student Award, which included a full tuition scholarship to Harvard University. He received a similar offer from Yale. Although proud of their son, Richard's parents determined it was too expensive for him to attend. So he enrolled in Whittier College, so his family could save money by having him live at home. Although disappointed, he was determined to make the best of it. He continued the activities he had started in high school, including serving on the college's debating team, performing in several plays, and gaining a place on the football team, albeit second string. He also served on the student body council in various positions, making it to president in his junior year in 1933. He was already a skillful campaigner, even at this early age. He clearly understood the power of constituency building and rewarding those who supported him. Yet even Whittier had its haves and have-nots. Richard longed to enter the premier social club on campus called the Franklins, but was snubbed because he came from a poor family. This would be the first of many painful rejections experienced throughout his life, each one building upon the last, leading to a burning resentment of the chosen few. In response, he and his friends founded a new society called the Orthogonians, derived from the ancient Greek word meaning rectangular, straight, and square. Richard wrote their manifesto, which read, "We were officially dedicated to the 4 B's, beans, brawn, brain, and bowels, with bowels meaning fortitude." To emphasize their working-class origins, for their yearbook picture, they wore no ties or suit coats, in contrast to the Franklins, who insisted upon it. In May 1934, he graduated from Whittier College with a degree in history. Right before he graduated, he learned that he had received a full scholarship to Duke University Law School. Coming to Duke with its collegiate Gothic architecture was like walking into a medieval fairy tale for Richard. He had never seen anything like it. He was also in awe of his fellow students, many of whom had attended Ivy League universities. He knew he had made the big time and was determined to do well, so he studied hard. One upperclassman nicknamed him Iron Butt for the amount of time he spent studying in the library. His hard work paid off, coming third in his class. His living conditions were wretched, a tool shed without plumbing. He ate Milky Way bars for breakfast to save money. He also encountered, for the first time, the extremity of racism in the South. His Quaker upbringing inspired him to address the issue openly by calling the unequal treatment a moral outrage. Everyone else remained silent. In his final semester, he headed to New York with his classmates to attend interviews at the top law firms there. He arrived with excellent references in hand from his professors, yet he felt self-conscious wearing his only suit, which was showing its wear. Looking around the plush waiting rooms filled with well-dressed people with polished manners, he acutely felt the pangs of shame of his upbringing, what we would today call imposter syndrome. He received only one offer, which he turned down. In the summer of 1937, he returned home to Whittier. Richard struggled to find a job, applying to various places, including the FBI, which came to nothing. He was despondent at his inability to find work, so his mother finally stepped in and found him a position at a local law firm, Wingett and Bewley. Richard found the work boring. One case he worked on ended in disaster because he stupidly asked the opposing counsel how to complete the paperwork. His client sued his firm for malpractice, yet the firm did not fire him. In fact, they made him a partner 2 years later. He was grateful, but he yearned to do something else. Even so, he found a reason to stay just a little longer because he met a girl during an audition at a local playhouse for a role in the play, The Dark Tower, in 1938. Her name was Patricia Ryan, and she mesmerized him. When he first tried to ask her out, she turned him down. He tried again a couple of days later, and she turned him down again, laughing at him. Yet his heart told him she was the one. So he replied, "Don't laugh. Someday I'm going to marry you." He stubbornly pursued her, even driving her to Los Angeles for dates with other boys. Pat Ryan was born Thelma Catherine Ryan, but she hated the name Thelma, so she changed it to Patricia. She grew up on a California farm in the middle of nowhere, in a family with a mercurial father and an accommodating but severe mother, similar to Richard's home life. Just like him, she wanted out, so she could make something of herself. She attended the University of Southern California, working odd jobs to support herself, and received top marks in her classes. She and Richard both resented the powerful elites. After 2 years of his continued attentions, Pat realized she had, indeed, found a soulmate and accepted Richard's proposal of marriage. They were wed at the Mission Inn in Riverside, California, on the 21st of June 1940, and spent their honeymoon in Mexico. The couple married during a troubled time. World War II had already begun in the rest of the world, and America would soon find itself involved in the struggle. Because the government needed smart people to run the bureaucracy, Richard received a job offer to work in the new Office of Price Administration, known as the OPA, as a staff attorney in Washington, D.C. Both Pat and Richard had longed to travel, so the idea of living in such a city excited them. Yet, once there, Richard found the work dull and uninspiring. He longed for a political career and knew that military service had a way of leveling the playing field for those who worked hard to rise in the ranks. Despite his Quaker upbringing, he wanted to play a more active part in the war. He enlisted in the Navy, was sent to Naval Officer Training School at Naval Air Station Quonset Point, Rhode Island, in August 1942, and then waited for his orders, all the while requesting a transfer to the front. He got it in May 1943 and reported to the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific Air Transport Command, known as SCAT. Although assigned to the rear echelon, Richard moved around to postings at Guadalcanal, Vella La Vella, and Bougainville, where he experienced bombing by the Japanese. He had expected actual combat on Green Island, another one of his postings, but the Japanese had already retreated. Lacking opportunities to truly fight, Richard found ways to make his mark anyway. In Bougainville and Green Island, Richard opened what came to be known as Nick's Hamburger Stand to feed flight crews before they headed out on missions. He also proved to be a poker shark, earning a substantial sum in winnings, which he sent home to Pat, who was living in San Francisco working as an analyst at the OPA. At the war's end, the Navy quickly reassigned him, first sending him to Alameda Air Station in San Francisco, then east to study federal contracting law. They lived in Baltimore while Richard worked as one of several lawyers cancelling Navy contracts at the end of the war. In September 1945, Richard received an auspicious letter from Herman Perry, a bank manager and trustee of Whittier College, whom Richard knew from his time in Whittier. Perry asked him if he might be interested in running for Congress on the Republican ticket in 1946. It took Pat and him less than 48 hours to reply. After resigning his commission, he was honorably discharged from the Navy at the rank of lieutenant commander. Richard finally had an opportunity to pursue a career in politics, yet hurdles remained. They were expecting their first child, Tricia, born on the 21st of February 1946. His nomination to run was also not a sure thing. Richard still had to run the gauntlets of the Republican Committee in Southern California and gain their approval. Even so, it quickly became clear that this bright young man, with commendable military service and a growing family, was saleable merchandise. Richard also had much to learn about how to win in politics. Perry put him in touch with key players who taught Richard how to play the game. Murray Chotiner was a California lawyer, public relations man, and political consultant. One of his cardinal rules was, destroy your opponent. Another invaluable supporter was Kyle Palmer, the political reporter for the Los Angeles Times, who shaped public opinion and functioned like a political boss in the region. Without Palmer's support, a political career had no chance. Richard's opponent was Jerry Voorhis, who was a popular 5-term incumbent. The trick was to determine how to knock him down a few pegs. This political team found a way. Voorhis's support of the National Citizens Political Action Committee, or NCPAC, could be easily confused with supporting the Congress of Industrial Organizations Political Action Committee, or CIO-PAC, a very liberal group with communist leanings. As the Soviet Union increased its control over Eastern Europe, there was the fear of a growing communist threat to America. Stopping communism became a key political talking point. During a public debate on the 13th of September 1946, Richard managed to smear Voorhis with socialist communist sympathies. Voorhis just spluttered at this accusation, completely stymied. His overall rambling debate performance did not help him either. On election day, Richard roared to victory with 57% of the vote. Richard hit the ground running when he entered the 80th United States Congress. Although he had wanted a seat on the House Judiciary Committee, his lack of seniority placed him on the Education and Labor Committees instead. He made friends quickly with other freshmen and junior congressmen, including John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, a future presidential rival, and Gerald R. Ford of Michigan, who would succeed him as president. But in 1947, all were just trying to score politically to make a name for themselves. The very first Kennedy-Nixon debate occurred in McKeesport, Pennsylvania on the 27th of April 1947 as part of a roadshow sponsored by the House Education Committee to discuss labor policy. The two men bonded during this experience, realizing they had similar insecurities, even though they came from opposite ends of the socio-economic scale. In January 1947, Richard and Pat received an invitation to a dinner party at Christian Herter's home. Herter was a former State Department diplomat and a high-ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Pat and Richard misunderstood the attire requirements for the event and arrived in cocktail dress rather than formal wear. Despite this faux pas, Herter took a shine to this shy congressman from California, seeing a piece of himself in Richard and recognizing his promise. A few months later, Richard received an unexpected invitation to serve on the Herter Committee. He was the youngest member of this 19-member delegation. The plan was to travel through Europe to assess the economic damage caused by World War II, draft a report detailing the region's difficulties, and create a large foreign aid package based upon real needs. Historically, this aid package would come to be known as the Marshall Plan, named after General George C. Marshall, then serving as President Harry Truman's Secretary of State. Richard Nixon was so excited to finally have a chance to do something statesmanlike and resolved to take advantage of this opportunity to build his foreign affairs credentials. He worked hard to make a substantial contribution to the team. His experiences in Europe, witnessing the devastation wrought by war, helped him realize the level of the threat communism posed not only to Europe but also to the United States. Richard felt that America had no choice but to help Europe economically in order to save itself. America had to lead, and the Marshall Plan was the way to do it. When it came time for a vote on the legislation to fund this plan, Richard voted according to his conscience, against the wishes of his isolationist constituents back home. He flew to California to make his case. He defended his decision well enough that he won re-election to a second House term in 1948. In that same year, Richard and Pat welcomed their second daughter, Julie, on the 5th of July. At the start of his second term, Richard found himself on a congressional committee that had little respect, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. Its members had a reputation for implementing foolish wild goose chases and consistently showed a profound disregard for constitutional rights. Many in Congress hoped Richard, seen as a straight-shooting lawyer with solid anti-communist credentials, might be able to rein in some of this committee's excesses. Richard's interaction with Alger Hiss led to events that changed everything and cemented his reputation as a communist fighter. During a congressional committee hearing, Mr. Hiss treated Richard, a poor boy, with patrician disdain, which Nixon resented. What unnerved him even more was when Mr. Hiss claimed that he did not know Whittaker Chambers, even though Chambers had named Hiss specifically during a previous hearing, insisting he had worked with Hiss on many covert actions for the Soviets. Richard smelled a rat. Chambers was an American writer and editor who had worked for Time magazine. During his testimony, he named several people who had participated in the communist underground during the 1930s. Hiss worked in the State Department for years and was a Harvard-educated lawyer. He was summoned specifically because of Chambers' testimony. Richard knew someone was lying and wanted to dig further, but everyone told him that Hiss could never be a spy because he was one of the establishment elites. Yet Richard's gut told him otherwise, and during a second private interview with Chambers, his hunch was bolstered when it became apparent that Chambers knew facts about Hiss that only a close associate could know. What changed everything was a committee summons that required Chambers to disclose his evidence. In response, on the 2nd of December 1948, Chambers led 2 investigators to a pumpkin patch on his Maryland farm and opened a carved pumpkin. Inside were rolls of microfilm. This microfilm, now called the Pumpkin Papers, contained documents that proved definitely that Hiss had been a spy during the 1930s while working at the State Department. Although the statute of limitations for espionage had ended, Hiss could be tried for perjury. After a long trial, Hiss was convicted in 1950 and served 5 years in prison. Richard's hunch made him a celebrity in Washington and launched him into a Senate bid against Congresswoman Helen Gahagan Douglas, a wealthy, one-time Hollywood starlet who was a devotee of President Franklin D. Roosevelt and was married to Melvyn Douglas, a Hollywood actor. After a bruising primary battle, Richard won his party's nomination. Now the real work began to determine the best way to destroy Douglas. Using his anti-communist credentials, he went for the jugular based on her voting record. During a public debate, he emphasized her suspicious, liberal-leaning Senate record. Richard's election staff also distributed a flyer printed on pink paper which documented her votes that appeared partisan towards communism. To hit home his point, Richard's supporters started calling her the Pink Lady to paint her further as a secret communist. She, in turn, inexplicably tried to smear Richard as a communist sympathizer. Because of her experience with Richard, she created the nickname Tricky Dick that stuck with him for his entire life. Richard won his seat in the Senate by a huge 20-point margin. Richard's work in Congress brought him to the attention of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had led the Allied invasion of Normandy during World War II. He was planning to run for president in 1952 and was looking for a running mate. His campaign knew they needed someone from the West to help balance the ticket, preferably from Texas, California, or Arizona. Richard had other key credentials as well. He was a proven internationalist, like Eisenhower, and supported the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. And unlike Joseph McCarthy, who rose to power through his rabid attacks on anyone suspected of communist leanings, the Eisenhower team did not lump Richard in with the McCarthyite Disciples of Hate. One reason for this was that Richard stood up for academic freedom when the McCarthyites wanted to ban subversive books. To clinch the deal, they both came from similar tough backgrounds and rose to prominence through sheer hard work and tenacity. Although Eisenhower nearly lost the nomination for the Republican ticket, the backroom brawling in which Richard played a part led to their victory at the Republican convention in Chicago. As Pat and Richard stood on the stage with Eisenhower and his wife Mamie, they marveled at the fact that in just 6 years they had moved from being nobodies to being political celebrities. Their lives would never be the same again. Soon the political vultures started circling, trying to find a way to take down the Eisenhower-Nixon ticket. Somehow a rumor got started about a Nixon slush fund, which allowed the family to use campaign dollars so they could live beyond their means. It was a shocking allegation and not completely true. The debate began among the Eisenhower advisors about what to do with Richard. Many supporters told Eisenhower to dump Nixon. Richard's instincts told him to fight back. Defying advice and an oblique order from Eisenhower, Richard decided to take his case to the people. He would present the facts on television. He made it clear to Pat that he would have to fully disclose their financial situation, which horrified and embarrassed her. On the 23rd of September 1952, Richard stared into the camera and told the American people the truth about the Nixon family's finances, with Pat looking on. He refuted accusations that Pat wore mink coats. He declared, "She does have a respectable Republican cloth coat, and I always tell her she'd look good in anything." Later in the speech, he mentioned that they did receive an election gift from a supporter after this man had heard Pat mention that their girls wanted a dog. So he sent them a Cocker Spaniel. Richard explained, and our little girl Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're gonna keep it. The speech would go down in history as the Checkers speech. He not only made television history, but he also diffused the controversy. The Eisenhower ticket went on to win the presidency that November. However, this insubordination did not go unnoticed by Eisenhower, realizing that his new vice president had a mind of his own. Many ask what the relationship between Eisenhower and Richard Nixon was like. We will probably never know for sure. What we do know is that Ike Eisenhower saw enough potential that he made sure that Richard gained experience in the workings of government at the presidential level. He did this because, when he learned that Harry Truman entered the presidency after Franklin Roosevelt died, with no idea what had been going on, including the Manhattan Project that was established to make a nuclear bomb, he was horrified. Ike did not want that to happen to his vice president if anything happened to him. It turned out to be a good thing, since Richard, over his 8 years as vice president, had to step in several times as acting president when Ike suffered a heart attack and a mild stroke. Richard won praise for his deft handling of these situations, by picking up the mantle effectively, but never formally assuming the trappings of power, including refusing to sit in the president's chair during meetings. Ike also used Richard as his international eyes and ears, sending him on 2 goodwill tours to over 30 countries in the Middle East and Asia, including reviewing the work of the US military in Vietnam. One of Richard's most eventful and important tours occurred after they had won re-election in 1956. Pat and Richard made a goodwill trip to South America. It was not an easy trip. In several countries, people lined the streets protesting against American meddling in South American affairs. Some just shouted insults. Others pelted the car with food and rocks. The worst incident occurred in Caracas, Venezuela, where initially people spat on them from the buildings above. Then mobs began to flow out of the side streets carrying crowbars and stones. After a few hard whacks, the supposedly unbreakable glass of the car they were in showered fragments everywhere. The mob then started rocking the car, and everyone inside thought they were going to die. A press truck broke up the crowd and gave Richard's driver a way out of the mob. Richard and Pat returned home as national heroes. The next summer, Richard did another goodwill tour to the Soviet Union, where, during a tour of the American exhibit in Moscow, Richard and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev discussed the merits of democratic freedom versus communism. Photos taken during a tour of a kitchen exhibit showed Richard Nixon engaged in debate, jabbing a finger in Khrushchev's chest. The actual truth of the visit was much less dramatic. Richard was uncomfortable, even intimidated by the Premier's blustering threats. But the press loved the idea of a kitchen debate, and the administration used this inflated press coverage to score political points back home. With a new constitutional amendment that did not allow a president to run for a 3rd term, Richard Nixon appeared to be Eisenhower's successor for the 1960 Republican nomination for president. However, getting nominated was the easy part for Richard. Then, everything began to go wrong. First, his opponent became his old House friend and now Senator John F. Kennedy, with Lyndon B. Johnson, the Senate Majority Leader from Texas, as his running mate. Next, a reporter asked Eisenhower about Richard's impact on policy during his administration. Eisenhower replied, "If you give me a week, I might think of one." Richard also made bad campaign management decisions, such as running much of the campaign himself and insisting upon visiting all 50 states during the campaign. What he created for himself was a grueling, almost unmanageable schedule. This mattered when it came time to do the first televised presidential debate on the 26th of September 1960. A few weeks before, Richard's horrendous schedule landed him in hospital with a staphylococcal skin infection, and he had barely recovered from it before the debate. Kennedy had taken it easy the previous week and appeared on set, rested and suntanned. That day, Richard arrived late to the television studio, refused to wear makeup, making his deep-set eyes seem darker and more ominous, and he appeared to the viewers tired and pale, largely because he was. For those who listened to this debate by radio, the polls showed most felt Richard had won. However, to those who watched the television debate, Kennedy had appeared vigorous and presidential. Richard appeared as a caricature of another nickname that followed him through life, Gloomy Gus. He did better in subsequent debates, but he had lost substantial political momentum. Although Kennedy won the election, it was by far the smallest popular vote count margin in US history. There was some evidence that the Kennedy campaign had used their mob and political boss connections in both Illinois and Texas to help shift votes in Kennedy's favor. After the election, Kennedy's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, called Richard to ask if he intended to contest the election. Richard decided to do the right thing for the country and concede, but he never forgave the Kennedy family for their campaign dishonesty. Richard now found himself in what felt like a political wilderness. He had never lost an election before. That summer, Richard began writing his first memoir, 6 Crises, published in 1962. Although he tried to put politics behind him, he simply could not. when several California state Republican leaders asked him to run against the incumbent governor Edmund Gerald "Pat" Brown. Richard accepted reluctantly. It proved to be an expensive and bitter fight. Throughout the campaign, the press hounded Richard. The Brown campaign tried to smear him in a variety of ways, pushing hard on evidence of suspected dirty money dealings with Howard Hughes, one of the wealthiest men in the world. Supposedly, Richard's brother Don received a huge loan from Hughes, implying Richard may have received secret money from him as well. Richard did a repeat of his Chequers speech, and it stopped this particular smear campaign. Then, international affairs conspired against him. The Cuban Missile Crisis hit the nation in October, right before the election, and it led to the defection of Republican supporters. He also lacked key political operatives such as Kyle Palmer, who was very ill, to help shape statewide political opinion. Richard suffered a devastating loss to Brown by a 5% margin. Angry and hurt, Nixon held a press conference in which he severely criticized the press. One statement would haunt him for the rest of his life. "For 16 years, you, the press, have had a lot of fun and opportunity to attack me. But as I leave you, I want you to know you don't have Nixon to kick around anymore because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference." The following year, he moved his family to New York, taking a position at a Wall Street law firm that was renamed Nixon, Mudge, Rose, Guthrie, and Alexander. He now had the opportunity to read widely and study the philosophies of great historical leaders. He traveled the world to help bolster his international credentials, including a trip to Vietnam, where he believed that nothing short of total victory could end the war. He also campaigned for congressional candidates all over the country for both the 1964 and 1966 elections. On the 2nd of February 1968, Richard Nixon took an unexpected step and announced his intention to run in the 1968 presidential election. It looked like an auspicious time to do so. He had renewed his standing within the Republican Party by helping colleagues win their congressional elections. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who had succeeded Kennedy after his assassination in 1963 and won the presidency in his own right in 1964, was hunkered down in the White House as students rioted, screaming threatening taunts because of what they perceived as his murderous, secretive execution of the Vietnam War. The country seemed to be descending into political and social chaos, and the nation's international standing was in shambles. Things got so bad that Johnson held a press conference on the 31st of March 1968 to say that he had halted the bombing of North Vietnam, also calling for peace talks and stating that he had decided not to run for president in 1968. Yet, Richard announced his intentions knowing he was not a sure bet for the Republican nomination. During the primaries, he had to downplay his reputation as a two-time loser and had to defeat formidable challengers for the nomination, including Ronald Reagan, governor of California, Nelson Rockefeller, governor of New York, Harold Stassen, president of the University of Pennsylvania, and George W. Romney, governor of Michigan. He used his international credentials to fashion himself as a president who would end the war in Vietnam, declaring he would achieve peace with honor. He tried to appeal to Middle America by insisting he was a nice guy, a new Nixon. He also played both sides of Southern racial sympathies by insisting on a platform of law and order, a code for controlling civil rights marches and black people in general, while also playing up his Quaker roots and affinity to the black struggle for equal rights. As the year progressed, more chaos ensued with the assassination in April of Martin Luther King, Jr., the leader of the Black Civil Rights Movement, followed 2 months later by the assassination of the chief Democratic rival Robert Kennedy in June. The nation longed for a strong leader who would bring peace to both America and overseas, especially Vietnam. Richard won the nomination and picked Spiro Agnew, then governor of Maryland, playing to the Southern white vote, as his running mate. The 1968 election was a three-way race between Hubert Humphrey, the current vice president and Democratic nominee, George Wallace, governor of Alabama and unabashed white supremacist and the American Independent Party nominee, and Richard Nixon as the Republican nominee. rumors began to fly that Johnson had an ace up his sleeve to help his vice president win the election, an October surprise in the form of a peace treaty with North Vietnam. Historical evidence shows that Richard Nixon used his connections to prevent it by encouraging the withdrawal of the South Vietnamese delegation from the talks, the result being that the anticipated Democratic peace bump fizzled. In the end, it was a close election, with Nixon winning by less than 1% of the popular vote. Yet, he had won the presidency in one of the greatest political comebacks of all time. He was sworn in with his hand resting upon two Millhouse family Bibles, one of which was opened to Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, to emphasize the theme of his inaugural address. The greatest honor that history can bestow is the title of peacemaker. Throughout his speech, Richard spoke of national reconciliation. No man can be fully free, he said, while his neighbor is not. To go forward, we must go forward together. This means black and white together as one nation. He also emphasized the tone he wanted to set by saying, "We cannot learn from one another until we stop shouting at one another." Richard's first term in office proved to be one of the most productive in presidential history. On the domestic front, the Nixon administration created several new agencies, including the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission. He reorganized the Postal Service into a quasi-federal private corporation, expanded the National Park Service, and encouraged the development of local community and state parks through the Legacy of Park program. In 1970, in response to the rise of the environmental movement, he signed groundbreaking legislation such as the Clean Air Act and the Water Pollution Control Act. Through the Rail Passenger Service Act, he created the public rail system called Amtrak, the only rail system of its kind in the US. He increased funding, not only for research to fight cancer, but also for the arts and public broadcasting. In spite of his conservative anti-welfare leanings, Richard increased spending on Social Security, Medicare, food stamps, and health insurance for low-income families and the elderly. He also signed legislation that lowered the voting age to 18. As well as this, Richard Nixon did not ignore the calls to address civil rights. His actions ended school segregation in the South. He also worked to ensure fair access to government contracts for minority-owned businesses. In addition, he signed legislation that created Title IX to establish equal educational opportunities for women. Furthermore, he passed legislation that changed how federal funds were distributed through the passage of the State and Local Fiscal Assistance Act, which shifted some federal funds to states so that they could take on more of the burden of management and distribution of funds. In response to fears about drug use in 1971, Richard declared a war on illegal drugs by increasing criminal penalties and prison time for offenders. Another key domestic issue was the economy, which suffered from a high trade deficit, high inflation, and growing unemployment. To address these problems, he imposed surcharges on imports. Furthermore, Congress passed the Economic Stabilization Act, which permitted the president to freeze wages and prices. The public loved it because it seemed to them the president was taking direct action to protect them. Although these actions were effective in the short term, it proved devastating in the long term by creating an environment perfect for a new economic phenomenon called stagflation. Even with these stellar first-term successes at home, Richard's crowning achievements were his foreign policy initiatives. Thinking beyond the usual straightforward methods of peace negotiations to end the Vietnam War, Richard realized that he might be able to play the two key financial backers of the North Vietnamese, the Soviet Union and China, against one another to change the geopolitical dynamics enough to bring all the players to the negotiating table. This strategy could work because neither China nor Russia trusted one another, and in areas where they had a common border, violent conflicts occurred frequently. Through his chief foreign envoy and national security advisor Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon began to search for a way to meet with Chinese officials. In 1971, China signaled an interest in opening doors by inviting American table tennis players to visit China after a world competition in Japan. This ping-pong diplomacy looked like the green light they had been looking for. Later that year, Kissinger managed to arrange a secret meeting with the Chinese government through his contacts in Pakistan. This meeting bore fruit with an invitation for the president to visit China in late February 1972. This week-long visit was telecast around the world. Some called it the week that changed the world. Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger had scored a major international coup by re-establishing direct relations with the People's Republic of China after its 22-year absence on the world stage. Almost immediately, the Soviets contacted their counterparts in the US to engage in a serious discussion regarding nuclear arms control. Nixon traveled to Moscow that May, the first sitting US president ever to visit the Kremlin. There he signed multiple treaties, including the first Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Treaty, or SALT I, and a memorandum summarizing the nature of their new relations, which came to be known as détente. Yet, overshadowing it all was the Vietnam War, failed incursions into Laos, and the extreme bombing of the Viet Cong in both North Vietnam and Cambodia had no effect on the North Vietnamese government, who seemed implacable and determined to fight on. The US tried various methods, including claiming Nixon was a madman who would do anything to end the war, including dropping an atom bomb, to conducting secret talks only with the North Vietnamese, to instituting Vietnamization, that is, slowly removing US forces so the South Vietnamese could take over, to appease the folks at home. Yet the war dragged on, and more young American men died. Peace proved elusive, in spite of Richard's election promises to end the war. Not only did America's youth erupt, but so did America as a whole, wondering why the madness had to continue. Leaks occur in any administration, but few took them as seriously as the Nixon administration, which preferred to function in private. One factor was the tension between Nixon and Kissinger. Although they had an unusual symbiotic relationship, neither one fully trusted the other. Kissinger's social charisma and popularity threatened Richard, who wanted full credit for their international achievements. Kissinger was also known to have a big mouth. In fact, many leaks from the White House originated with Kissinger. In 1971, a bombshell leak hit. Someone handed classified portions of the history of the US involvement in Vietnam, known as the Pentagon Papers, to the New York Times. When the Nixon White House ordered the paper to stop printing them, the Washington Post picked it up along with other news outlets. Richard was furious. He wanted to get to the bottom of who had leaked it. He assumed it was Kissinger, but he could not prove it. On his orders, Richard's staff soon developed a special investigations unit and hired staff to conduct this mission. This group became known as the Plumbers. It turned out the leak came from Daniel Ellsberg, who had served as a Kissinger aide and had helped with the CIA's rural pacification program in Vietnam, but had become disillusioned. Once the culprit was known, Richard wanted to destroy Ellsberg and ordered action to be taken. The Plumbers produced a plan, but executed their entry into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office so badly that they decided to trash it to make it look like a drug burglary gone awry. Yet they obtained no damning evidence against Ellsberg. Even so, Richard, facing re-election in 1972 and fearful of losing, decided to use the Plumbers to attack political opponents. In retrospect, he probably should not have bothered. He won by a landslide, winning all but one state, beating his opponent, George McGovern, a staunch anti-war advocate and senator from South Dakota, in one of the largest popular vote margins in history. Richard Nixon should have relished this win. Instead, he felt depressed. It was hard to tell whether this was due to events related to the Plumbers or his own personal insecurities, yet his response unnerved many of his staff. No matter the reason, his previous actions and the actions of others intended to damage Richard's opponents had started a political ticking time bomb with the arrest on the 17th of June 1972 of G. Gordon Liddy, a former FBI agent, James W. McCord Jr., a former CIA operative, and 3 Cuban exile assistants, after breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters located in a large building complex called Watergate to plant surveillance bugs. Richard's second term began auspiciously enough. On the 27th of January 1973, a treaty was signed in Paris that formally ended the war in Vietnam. The following month, American prisoners of war came home. On the 24th of May 1973, Pat and Richard Nixon hosted the largest dinner ever held in the White House, honoring all returning POWs. In June, the Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev visited the US to continue nuclear arms talks, called Summit 2, resulting in a Prevention of Nuclear War agreement. In October, Israel found itself attacked on all sides by Syrian and Egyptian forces, resulting in the Yom Kippur War. The US not only poured in military aid, but also began an effort to calm tensions in the Middle East. This peace process became known as shuttle diplomacy, as Kissinger flew from country to country throughout the Middle East trying to end hostilities. Although military action halted, the Arabs protested by instituting an oil embargo, which led to long queues at the gas pumps in the US and Western Europe and more economic troubles. Domestically, Richard Nixon had additional achievements, including ending the military draft on the 27th of January 1973, expanding the scope of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission with the Rehabilitation Act to ensure people with disabilities had opportunities for employment, and several actions to change US policy towards improving relations with Native Americans, including increasing funding for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Yet, by May 1973, when the Senate began its televised Watergate hearings, efforts to stem the political bleeding consumed the Nixon White House. In October, Richard was hit with a second controversy over the business dealings of his Vice President Spiro Agnew, who was indicted for bribery, extortion, and tax fraud while governor of Maryland. He soon resigned the vice presidency. 2 days later, on the 12th of October 1973, Gerald Ford, a congressman from Michigan and the leader of the Republican Party, was nominated as vice president and confirmed on the 6th of December. The Watergate situation became explosive on the 20th of October when Nixon refused to hand over his presidential tapes and ordered his Attorney General to fire Archibald Cox, who had been appointed as an independent special prosecutor in May. His recently appointed Attorney General Elliot Richardson, as well as his assistant William Ruckelshaus, both refused to carry out the order and resigned. Only Robert Bork, then the Solicitor General, complied. This event came to be known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Richard then appointed Leon Jaworski, a prominent attorney in Washington, as the special prosecutor. Richard still refused to turn over the tape recordings of conversations he had had with staff in the White House. This action only made his opponents more dogged in the pursuit to discover not only who ordered the burglary, but also the subsequent cover-up that had become apparent to many. Government officials as well as journalists, including the now famous Washington Post investigators Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, with the help of the Associate Director of the FBI, Mark Felt, also known as Deep Throat, continued to dig deeper. Richard fell back on what had succeeded in the past and chose to take his message to the people via television on the 17th of November 1973, where he declared, "I am not a crook." It had the opposite of his intended effect. As more staff testified or were indicted, the situation became dangerous. The endgame occurred on the 24th of July 1974, when the US Supreme Court decided the case United States versus Nixon, which forced Richard to turn over the tapes. The US House moved to begin impeachment proceedings against Nixon soon after. One tape section that contained Richard's conversation with his Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, about giving hush payments to the burglars, the plumbers, and other cover-up tactics was released in early August. This section became known as the smoking gun. On the 9th of August 1974, Richard M. Nixon resigned his presidency, the first and only US president ever to do so. Gerald Ford was sworn in as president almost as soon as Richard's helicopter lifted off. A month later, Ford ended all Watergate investigations by giving Richard a full pardon, a very controversial act. Yet Ford knew that the country had been torn apart by Watergate, and it could not endure more years of legal wrangling. Before he acted, he made sure Richard Nixon knew that a pardon would mean an admittance of guilt. Richard accepted his guilt and wrote a statement published in the New York Times and other papers apologizing to the nation. In it he said, "No words can describe the depth of my regret and pain at the anguish my mistakes over Watergate have caused the nation and the presidency, a nation I so deeply love and an institution I so greatly respect." Watergate devastated many who had worked for Richard. Over 40 government officials, including chiefs of staff in the Nixon administration, were indicted or jailed. Ashamed by his actions and aware of how his hubris led not only to his undoing, but the undoing of many whom he cared about, Richard worked hard for the rest of his life to rehabilitate his reputation and to make amends. In the summer of 1977, millions watched a series of 4 interviews he had with the British journalist David Frost. The following year, Richard Nixon published his main memoir entitled R.N., The Memoirs of Richard Nixon, which sold millions of copies. He wrote many more books explaining his philosophy on international affairs and politics in general. He honorably served the role as elder statesman to his successors, including Presidents Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. In 1990, Richard Nixon attended the dedication of the Richard Nixon Library and birthplace in Yorba Linda, California, with 4 presidents and their first ladies attending, along with 50,000 friends and supporters. In 1993, Pat died in their home in New Jersey at the age of 81 after suffering from lung cancer. Richard was overcome by emotion at her funeral. In January 1994, Richard opened the Nixon Center for Peace and Freedom, a foreign policy think tank that focused on international conflict resolution through pragmatic and principled realism. In April 1994, Richard suffered a massive stroke and died a few days later at the age of 81. He was buried next to Pat at the Nixon Library. Many prominent people attended the memorial service, with the Reverend Billy Graham, a longtime family friend and a famous Christian evangelist, officiating. During his eulogy, Republican Senator Robert Dole of Kansas declared that the latter half of the 20th century would become known as the Age of Nixon. What do you think of Richard M. Nixon? Do you see Nixon as a power-hungry megalomaniac, as some have said, or do you see him as someone who let his own insecurities create problems, real or imagined? Did he achieve his goal of leaving footprints on the sands of time? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.